The year is 1890. In the remote village of Kim Lien, Anh An Province, central Vietnam, a child is born who will, in time, shake the foundations of empires. He is given the name Nguyen Sinh Kung, the second son of Nguyen Sinh Sac, a scholar steeped in Confucian tradition, and Hong Thilon, a woman of gentle disposition but firm resolve. Their home, a modest bamboo dwelling with a thatched roof, offered little comfort beyond the warmth of family. This was French Indochina, a land brutally carved out by European powers, where the very air seemed to hum with the quiet desperation of a colonized people. The French had arrived in force decades earlier, steadily asserting control, first over Cochin China in the south, then Annam and Tonkin in the center and north, forming what they officially declared the Indo-Chinese Union in 1887. For generations, Vietnam had been an independent kingdom, its history a tapestry woven with resistance against Chinese domination. Now, a new oppressor had arrived, one with superior weaponry, a different culture, and an insatiable appetite for resources. The French exploited the land's rice, coal, rubber, and minerals, shipping them back to the metropole, enriching themselves while the Vietnamese peasantry toiled in poverty. Their lives dictated by the colonial administration. Taxes were heavy, often levied in rice, and those who could not pay faced brutal reprisals. Education, for the most part, was reserved for the privileged few who embraced French culture and served colonial interests. Traditional Vietnamese scholars, like Nguyen Sinh Sac, found their world eroding, their Confucian ideals of benevolent rule and social harmony utterly disregarded by the foreign masters. They saw their heritage trampled, their language suppressed in official capacities, and their people treated as second-class citizens in their own homeland. Young Nguyen Sinh Kung, later known as Ho Chi Minh, grew up amidst this simmering resentment. His father, a man of strong nationalist convictions despite his work for the imperial court examinations, ensured that his children were educated not only in classical Chinese characters and Confucian texts, but also in the oral traditions of Vietnamese resistance heroes, tales of the Trung sisters, who rode elephants into battle against Chinese invaders in the 1st century CE, and Le Loi, who expelled the Ming dynasty in the 15th century, filled the small house, igniting a spark of defiance in the boy's mind. His elder brother Nguyen Sinh Kim and his sister Nguyen Thi Than also shared this intellectual ferment, absorbing their father's quiet discontent. The family lived simply, sometimes moving as Nguyen Sinh Sac sought to avoid direct entanglement with the French authorities while still attempting to navigate the changing world. He himself had passed the imperial examinations, a pathway to officialdom, but found himself increasingly disillusioned with a system that offered no real power to those loyal to Vietnam. The village of Kim Lien itself was a microcosm of colonial oppression. French-appointed mandarins, often corrupt, enforced colonial laws with an iron fist, backed by the ever-present threat of French soldiers. The rhythm of life, once dictated by the seasons and ancestral customs, was now distorted by the demands of the colonial economy. Land was seized for rubber plantations, its former cultivators reduced to indentured laborers, working under brutal conditions for meager wages. Opium, actively promoted by the French as a state monopoly, addiction spread like a plague, further debilitating the population and enriching the colonial coffers. The French strategy was clear: divide and conquer, exploit and suppress. They played various ethnic groups against each other, cultivated a small elite of collaborators, and ruthlessly crushed any sign of dissent. Nguyen Sinh Kung observed all of this with a quiet intensity, his youthful mind absorbing the injustices that permeated every aspect of Vietnamese life. He saw the proud, ancient culture of his people being systematically dismantled, replaced by a brutal alien system that prioritized profit over humanity. His mother, Hong Thilon, died in 1901 when Nguyen Sinh Kung was just 11 years old, leaving a profound void in the family. His father, already a man of melancholic temperament, became even more withdrawn, pouring his energies into his studies and his quiet acts of non-cooperation with the French. The family's circumstances worsened, forcing young Kung to take on greater responsibilities. This personal loss, combined with the pervasive suffering he witnessed around him, deepened his understanding of hardship and injustice. He saw how the colonial system not only exploited the land, but also broke the spirit of its people. The resilience of the Vietnamese, their quiet dignity in the face of immense adversity, left an indelible mark on him. He began to internalize the idea that freedom was not merely a political concept, but a fundamental human necessity, without which life itself was diminished. The question lingered, a quiet hum in the collective consciousness of a subjugated people. Can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past? This was not merely a philosophical exercise. It was a matter of daily survival, a question whispered in hushed tones in the rice paddies and marketplaces. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, was an attempt to answer it. And in the heart of a young boy named Nguyen Sinh Khang, that question began to take root, germinating into a resolve that would one day challenge the mightiest empires. Would you remember them, these forgotten voices of a land yearning for breath? The early 20th century dawned with a suffocating weight upon Vietnam. The French colonial administration, far from easing its grip, tightened it further. Governor-General Paul Doumer, who served from 1897 to 1902, famously declared that Indochina must be exploited for France's benefit, not developed for its own. This philosophy translated into a brutal system of taxation, monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium, and forced labor. The Vietnamese peasantry, already living on the brink, were pushed deeper into destitution. Resistance, though often fragmented and localized, simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into desperate, doomed revolts. These uprisings, such as the Can Vuong movement, that sought to restore the emperor, were met with overwhelming French force, their leaders executed or exiled, their followers dispersed. Nguyen Sinh Khang, still a young man, was acutely aware of this pervasive unrest. His father, Nguyen Sinh Sac, found himself increasingly at odds with the colonial authorities. After serving in a minor official capacity in Hue, the imperial capital, Sac was dismissed from his post for refusing to kowtow to French demands and for his overt sympathy with nationalist sentiments. This dismissal stripped the family of their already limited financial security and further exposed young Khang to the harsh realities of colonial rule. He saw his educated, principled father, a man who believed in the moral rectitude of governance, reduced to a wandering scholar, teaching privately to make ends meet, his spirit unbroken but his opportunities curtailed. This personal experience of injustice, amplified by the suffering he witnessed in the broader society, solidified his anti-colonial convictions. In 1908, at the age of 18, Nguyen Sinh Khang joined his father in Hue, the imperial city. Though nominally the seat of the Vietnamese emperor, was in reality a puppet of French power. It was a place of stark contrasts, the ancient grandeur of the forbidden Purple City, now overshadowed by French garrisons and colonial administrative buildings. Here Nguyen Sinh Khang enrolled in the Quoc Hoc Academy, a prestigious high school, originally established to train future mandarins. However, the curriculum was heavily influenced by French ideas, designed to produce compliant civil servants rather than independent thinkers. Despite this, the academy became a crucible for nascent Vietnamese nationalism, a place where young intellectuals secretly discussed revolutionary ideas and debated the future of their country. It was during his time at Quoc Hoc that Nguyen Sinh Khang participated in a peasant protest against high taxes. This was not an organized rebellion, but a spontaneous outpouring of desperation by farmers from the surrounding countryside. Driven to the brink by French levies, Khang, already known for his quiet intellect and moral uprightness, acted as an interpreter between the distressed villagers and the French officials, attempting to articulate their grievances. His involvement, though peaceful, marked him in the eyes of the French authorities. He was quickly expelled from the academy, his brief foray into formal education abruptly terminated. This event was a turning point, signaling to him the futility of seeking redress through sanctioned channels. It became clear that the French would not tolerate even the mildest forms of dissent. Following his expulsion, Nguyen Sinh Khang did not return to his village. Instead, he embarked on a journey across Vietnam, working various odd jobs: a teacher, a laborer, a deckhand. This period of travel was critical to his political education. He traversed the length of his subjugated homeland, witnessing firsthand the varied forms of French exploitation and the pervasive suffering it caused. In the northern region of Tonkin, he saw the brutal conditions in coal mines and the sprawling rubber plantations, where indentured laborers, many of them Vietnamese peasants, were worked to death under the scorching sun. In the south, Cochin China, he observed the vast rice paddies, their bounty enriching French merchants while the cultivators starved. He interacted with people from all walks of life, farmers, fishermen, scholars, and nascent urban workers, hearing their stories, sharing their frustrations, and deepening his understanding of the systemic nature of colonial oppression. He encountered different strands of Vietnamese nationalism. Some intellectuals advocated for gradual reform, hoping to persuade the French to grant greater autonomy. Others, like Phan Boi Cho, a prominent anti-colonial activist, called for armed struggle, drawing inspiration from Japan's modernization and military success against Russia. Still others looked to China, where the Qing dynasty was crumbling and revolutionary ideas were taking hold. Nguyen Sinh Kung absorbed these various perspectives, sifting through them, always returning to the fundamental question of how his nation could achieve true independence. He understood that a purely military approach might be too costly, and that appeals to French morality were largely futile. A deeper, more fundamental change was required. His travels also exposed him to the limitations of localized resistance. The French, with their superior military technology and centralized command, could easily crush scattered uprisings. A truly effective movement, he began to realize, would require unity, organization, and a broader understanding of the forces at play on the global stage. He saw that the Vietnamese struggle was not isolated but part of a larger pattern of colonialism that gripped much of the world. This realization would profoundly shape his future actions. His path was not yet clear, but his resolve solidified. He would dedicate his life to the liberation of Vietnam, no matter the personal cost. The philosophical question of whether a nation could be free while its people remained bound by the chains of the past echoed in the suffering faces he saw every day, the silence of a repressed people, the quiet desperation in their eyes. This was the landscape of Vietnam in the early 20th century. How many lives were consumed by this struggle, their stories fading into the relentless march of time. The confines of Vietnam, no matter how deeply felt, were proving insufficient for Nguyen Tat Than's burgeoning political consciousness. He understood, with an increasing clarity, that the struggle for Vietnamese independence was not merely a local affair. It was intertwined with the larger currents of global power, with the very nature of imperialism itself. To truly understand the enemy, he concluded, he had to see them on their own ground. He had to learn their strengths, their weaknesses, and the ideas that propelled their global dominance. This realization drove him to make a momentous decision. He would leave Vietnam. In 1911, under the alias Phan Ba, Nguyen Tat Than secured a job as a kitchen helper on the French cargo liner, the Amiral Le Touchetreville. The ship was bound for Europe, specifically France, the heart of the colonial empire that held his homeland in its grip. His departure was not a grand revolutionary act, but a quiet, determined step into the unknown. He carried little more than the clothes on his back, a burning curiosity, and an unwavering commitment to his people's freedom. He knew no one in France, spoke little French, and possessed no significant financial resources. His journey was, in essence, an act of profound self-reliance and audacious ambition. The voyage itself was an education. He worked tirelessly in the ship's galley, learning the routines of maritime life. The ship stopped at various ports: Singapore, Colombo, Port Said, Marseille. At each stop, Nguyen Tat Than disembarked, observing the lives of the local populations. He saw the stark differences between the colonial masters and the colonized peoples. Noting the pervasive poverty and lack of agency that characterized the latter, he witnessed the vastness of the French Empire, its tentacles stretching across continents, fueled by the exploitation of resources and labor from distant lands. This first-hand exposure to the global machinery of imperialism only reinforced his conviction that the Vietnamese struggle was part of a universal fight against oppression. Upon arriving in Marseille in July 1911, Nguyen Tat Than plunged into the bustling alien world of France. He was initially struck by the stark contrast between the rhetoric of French liberty, equality, and fraternity concepts he had heard about even in colonial Vietnam, and the brutal reality of French colonial rule he had witnessed. He found work wherever he could, often manual labor: a gardener, a snow sweeper, a stoker on a ship, a retoucher in a photographic studio. He lived in poverty, often hungry, moving from one rented room to another in the working-class districts of Paris and other French cities. These years were not marked by immediate political activism, but by intense self-education and observation. He spent countless hours in public libraries, devouring books on history, philosophy, and politics. He read works by French Enlightenment thinkers, by Marx, and by other revolutionary theorists. Often struggling with the language, but driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, he was particularly drawn to the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu, whose ideas on popular sovereignty and the separation of powers stood in stark contrast to the autocratic rule imposed on Vietnam. He also studied the French Revolution, analyzing its triumphs and failures, seeking lessons that might apply to his own country's struggle. He recognized the hypocrisy inherent in France's self-proclaimed status as a beacon of liberty, while it simultaneously subjugated millions in its colonies. This intellectual awakening was crucial. It provided him with a theoretical framework to understand the systemic nature of colonialism and to conceptualize a path towards liberation that went beyond simply expelling the French. He began to see the Vietnamese struggle not just as a nationalistic one, but as part of a global class struggle against oppression. His time in France also brought him into contact with various political groups and individuals. Though, at this early stage, his involvement was cautious and observational, he met with other exiled revolutionaries and anti-colonial activists from various parts of the world, exchanging ideas and experiences. He started to write articles for socialist and anti-colonial newspapers under pseudonyms, articulating the grievances of the Vietnamese people and exposing the brutalities of French rule. These early writings, though rudimentary, marked his transformation from an observer to an active participant in the anti-colonial discourse. He was honing his voice, developing his arguments, and beginning to carve out his identity as a spokesman for his subjugated nation. He recognized that the pen could be as powerful as the sword. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 further solidified his anti-imperialist views. He witnessed how the European powers, including France, plunged the world into a devastating conflict, sacrificing millions of lives in pursuit of imperial ambitions and economic dominance. He saw Vietnamese soldiers conscripted to fight for France, sent to the trenches of the Western Front to die for a cause that was not their own. This cynical exploitation of colonial subjects for the metropole's wars deeply angered him. It underscored the fundamental injustice of colonialism and strengthened his belief that true liberation would require a radical break from the existing world order. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated profoundly as Nguyen Tat Than observed the European powers clinging to their imperial past, even as they slaughtered each other on an unprecedented scale. He saw how the legacy of conquest and control continued to shackle both the colonizer and the colonized. What echoes do you hear from these distant shores? The end of the First World War in 1918 brought a wave of fervent hope and radical political ideas across Europe. For Nguyen Tat Than, now more commonly known as Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, this period represented an unprecedented opportunity. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, particularly his emphasis on self-determination for nations, resonated deeply with colonial subjects worldwide. Nguyen Ai Quoc saw this as a potential lever to pry open the doors of colonial empires. He, along with other Vietnamese patriots in France, drafted a petition demanding fundamental rights for the Vietnamese people, including freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and representation in the French Parliament. In 1919, Nguyen Ai Quoc attempted to present this petition to the leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered at the Versailles Peace Conference. He arrived in a rented suit, hoping to gain an audience with President Wilson, who had championed the principle of self-determination. However, his efforts were in vain. The petition, modest in its demands, was ignored by the world leaders who were primarily concerned with redrawing the map of Europe and securing their own imperial interests. This rejection was a pivotal moment for Nguyen Ai Quoc. It profoundly disillusioned him with the liberal democratic powers of the West. He realized that appeals to their sense of justice or their espoused ideals of liberty were futile when it came to the plight of colonized peoples. Their rhetoric of self-determination, he concluded, applied only to white European nations, not to the subjugated millions of Asia and Africa. This disillusionment pushed Nguyen Ai Quoc further towards radical ideologies. He had already been exposed to socialist ideas through his readings and his interactions with French workers. Now, he began to actively engage with the burgeoning communist movement. He was particularly drawn to Lenin's theses on the national and colonial questions. Published in 1920, Lenin argued that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism and that the liberation of colonial peoples was intrinsically linked to the global struggle against capitalism. This theoretical framework provided Nguyen Ai Quoc with a powerful lens through which to understand the roots of Vietnam's oppression and a strategy for its liberation. It offered a global solidarity that traditional nationalist movements lacked. In December 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc attended the Tours Congress of the French Socialist Party. The Congress was a crucial turning point for the French left, as it debated whether to align with the newly formed Third International Comintern, established by Lenin in Moscow. Nguyen Ai Quoc listened intently to the arguments, weighing the different paths forward. He was less interested in the intricacies of European socialist dogma and more concerned with which faction offered the most concrete support for colonial liberation. When the vote came, he sided with the majority that voted to form the French Communist Party and affiliate with the Comintern. His reasoning was pragmatic. The Communists, unlike the Socialists, explicitly advocated for the overthrow of colonialism and saw the struggles of oppressed nations as central to the global revolution. This decision marked a profound ideological commitment. From this point forward, Nguyen Ai Quoc was a communist. He believed that only through a revolutionary struggle, guided by Marxist-Leninist principles, could Vietnam achieve true independence and build a society free from exploitation. He became an active member of the French Communist Party, contributing articles to their newspaper, El Humanite, and becoming a vocal advocate for colonial emancipation. He organized Vietnamese expatriates, forming associations to raise awareness of their homeland's plight and to mobilize support for its liberation. His writings became sharper, more incisive, exposing the hypocrisy of French colonialism with clear, unadorned prose. He used his platform to highlight the brutal realities of life in Indochina: forced labor, crushing taxes, starvation, and the systematic suppression of any form of dissent. His reputation as a rising figure in the international communist movement grew. In 1923, he received an invitation to Moscow to attend a meeting of the Peasant International Christenton. This was a significant development, offering him direct access to the heart of the global communist revolution and its leaders. He seized the opportunity, understanding that practical experience and direct engagement with the Comintern would be invaluable for the future of the Vietnamese Revolution. His time in Moscow would provide him with ideological training, organizational skills, and connections that would prove critical in the decades to come. He was no longer just a passionate patriot. He was becoming a disciplined revolutionary, ready to translate theory into action. The question of whether a nation can ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past now took on a new dimension for Nguyen Ai Quoc. He saw that the chains of the past included not only the historical legacy of colonialism, but also the ideological limitations of past approaches to liberation. A new path, a radical break, was required. What courage would it take to walk that path, knowing the immense power of the forces arrayed against it? Nguyen Ai Quoc's arrival in Moscow in 1923 marked a crucial phase in his political education. The Soviet Union, still in its nascent years, was the epicenter of the global communist movement, and Moscow served as a veritable university for revolutionaries from across the world. He attended the Communist University of the Toilers of the East KUTV, an institution specifically designed to train cadres from colonial and semi-colonial countries. Here, he delved deeper into Marxist-Leninist theory, studying the strategies of revolution, party organization, and agitation. He learned about the practicalities of underground work, propaganda, and mass mobilization. This intensive training transformed him from a passionate anti-colonial activist into a disciplined, theoretically grounded revolutionary. Beyond academic instruction, Nguyen Ai Quoc engaged directly with prominent figures of the Comintern. He met with Leon Trotsky, participated in discussions with Joseph Stalin, and attended sessions of the Comintern's executive committee. He observed the internal debates and power struggles within the Soviet leadership. gaining a first-hand understanding of the complexities of revolutionary governance. While he absorbed the doctrines of the Comintern, he never lost sight of his primary objective, the liberation of Vietnam. He consistently advocated for greater attention and resources to be directed towards colonial struggles, arguing that the global revolution could not succeed without the emancipation of oppressed nations. He wrote articles for Soviet publications like Pravda and Izvestia, continuing to expose French atrocities in Indochina and champion the cause of Vietnamese independence. In late 1924, the Comintern dispatched Nguyen Ai Quoc to Canton, Guangzhou, China, then a volatile hub of revolutionary activity. China was in the midst of its own tumultuous transformation, with the Kuomintang KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen, attempting to unify the country and the nascent Chinese Communist Party CCP forming an uneasy alliance with them. This was a strategic move by the Comintern, as Canton offered a direct geographical link to Vietnam and a more practical base from which to organize a revolutionary movement in Indochina. He arrived under the alias Lai Tu, working as an interpreter for the Soviet advisor Mikhail Borodin, who was assisting the KMT. This role provided him with a unique vantage point, allowing him to observe the dynamics of a revolutionary alliance and the challenges of building a broad-based movement. In Canton, Nguyen Ai Quoc wasted no time in establishing the Revolutionary Youth League of Vietnam Thanh Nguyen. This organization was designed to recruit and train young Vietnamese expatriates and those who managed to escape from French Indochina. He selected promising young men, some of whom would later become key leaders in the Vietnamese Revolution, and personally instructed them in revolutionary theory, political organizing, and the principles of guerrilla warfare. He emphasized the importance of a disciplined vanguard party and the need to mobilize the peasantry, recognizing their immense potential as a revolutionary force. He also started a newspaper, Thanh Nguyen Youth, which was smuggled into Vietnam, carrying his anti-colonial message and revolutionary directives. His activities in Canton were not without immense risk. The French Secret, their colonial intelligence agency, maintained a significant presence in the region and was constantly hunting for Vietnamese nationalists. Nguyen Ai Quoc operated under various aliases, constantly moving and meticulously planning his movements to avoid detection. He understood that a single misstep could lead to his arrest, torture, and probable execution. Despite the constant threat, he systematically built a network of dedicated revolutionaries, laying the groundwork for a future communist party in Vietnam. He facilitated the return of trained cadres to Vietnam, instructing them to establish underground cells, organize workers and peasants, and spread the revolutionary message. The complex political landscape of Canton, with its shifting alliances between the KMT and the CCP, further refined Nguyen Ai Quoc's strategic thinking. He learned the importance of adapting revolutionary tactics to specific local conditions, rather than rigidly adhering to theoretical dogma. He witnessed the strengths and weaknesses of both nationalist and communist approaches, reinforcing his conviction that a unified, disciplined vanguard party was essential for Vietnam's liberation. He recognized that while international solidarity was vital, the ultimate success of the revolution would depend on the indigenous strength and resolve of the Vietnamese people themselves. In early 1941, after 30 years of exile, Ho Chi Minh, the name by which he would henceforth be widely known, meaning he who enlightened, secretly crossed the border into Vietnam. He entered through the remote, mountainous region of Pac Bo in Cao Bang province, near the Chinese border. This was a strategic choice. The area was rugged, difficult for French forces to penetrate, and inhabited by various ethnic minority groups who were historically marginalized and receptive to calls for autonomy. He established his base in a small, concealed cave deep in the jungle. This humble hideout, with a small stream running through it, became the command center for the Vietnamese Revolution. From Pac Bo, Ho Chi Minh immediately set about implementing his strategy for a broad national front. On May 19, 1941, he convened the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. At this pivotal meeting, the decision was made to establish the League for the Independence of Vietnam, Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, universally known as the Viet Minh. This was not merely a communist organization, it was a broad nationalist front, open to all Vietnamese patriots, regardless of their political or social background, who wished to overthrow French and Japanese domination. Its stated goals were clear: national liberation, the abolition of oppressive taxes, and the establishment of a democratic republic. Ho Chi Minh understood that unity was paramount, and that a national liberation struggle could only succeed if it transcended narrow ideological divides. The formation of the Viet Minh marked a decisive turning point. Ho Chi Minh, with his long experience in international communism, his deep understanding of Vietnamese history, and his unparalleled ability to connect with the common people, began to build a revolutionary infrastructure from the ground up. He emphasized propaganda, using simple language and folk songs to explain the Viet Minh's objectives to the illiterate peasantry. He cultivated local leaders, trained self-defense units, and organized mutual aid societies. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, now took on a new urgency. Ho Chi Minh believed that the chains were not only French occupation, but also the internal divisions and apathy that colonization had fostered. His task was to awaken a nation, to forge a united will for freedom. The arduous journey had just begun. How many would answer this quiet call from the jungle? From his humble cave in Pac Bo, Ho Chi Minh, along with his key lieutenants, most notably Vo Nguyen Giap and Pham Van Dong, meticulously began to build the Viet Minh's foundation. Their initial efforts focused on the ethnic minority communities in the northern border regions, the T Nung and Dao, people who had long faced marginalization and oppression under French rule. Ho Chi Minh understood that genuine support could not be imposed but had to be cultivated. He emphasized direct engagement with the villagers, learning their dialects, respecting their customs, and addressing their immediate needs. Propaganda was disseminated through simple songs, poems, and stories that conveyed the message of national liberation in an easily understandable way. The Viet Minh cadres assisted villagers in daily tasks, organized literacy classes, and helped resolve local disputes. This approach, known as Three Togethers, eat, live, and work together with the people, built deep trust and loyalty. They explained that their struggle was not merely about expelling the French, but about achieving a society where all Vietnamese, regardless of background, could live in dignity and prosperity. Slowly but surely, the Viet Minh network expanded, extending its reach from remote mountain villages into the lowlands, establishing clandestine cells and preparing the ground for broader mobilization. The cadres identified and trained local leaders, turning them into extensions of the revolutionary movement. Meanwhile, the global conflict of World War II cast a long shadow over Indochina. In September 1940, Imperial Japan, seeking resources for its war machine and aiming to cut off Allied supply lines to China, invaded and occupied northern Indochina. The French Vichy colonial administration, weakened by the defeat of France by Nazi Germany, quickly acquiesced. While the Japanese military occupied key strategic points, they largely allowed the French colonial apparatus to remain in nominal control, creating a bizarre and oppressive dual administration. This meant that the Vietnamese people now suffered under the exploitation of two imperial powers: the Japanese, who demanded rice, rubber, and minerals for their war effort, and the French, who continued to levy taxes and maintain their coercive system of rule. The consequences of this dual exploitation were devastating. Both the Japanese and French requisitioned vast quantities of rice, the staple food, to feed their armies and populations. Farmers were forced to sell their harvests at artificially low prices, or had their crops simply confiscated. The Japanese also ordered the conversion of rice paddies to industrial crops like jute for military use, further exacerbating food shortages. French colonial policies, already prone to corruption and inefficiency, compounded the crisis. Transportation networks, vital for distributing food, were disrupted by the war and targeted by Allied bombing raids. This systematic exploitation, coupled with natural disasters in the form of floods and droughts, culminated in the catastrophic Vietnamese famine of 1944 to 1945. Millions of Vietnamese, primarily in the northern provinces, starved to death. Estimates vary, but between 1 and 2 million people perished out of a population of approximately 20 million. The sight of emaciated bodies littering the streets, the desperation in the eyes of the living, left an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. The French and Japanese, seemingly indifferent to the suffering, continued their requisitions, hardening the resolve of the Vietnamese people against their oppressors. The famine proved to be a powerful catalyst for the Viet Minh. While the colonial powers demonstrated their callous disregard for human life, the Viet Minh actively stepped into the void. They organized raids on Japanese and French rice warehouses, distributing the seized food to the starving population. They established relief committees, provided medical aid where possible, and offered a message of hope and liberation amidst the widespread despair. This demonstrated a stark contrast. The oppressors took, while the Viet Minh gave. Their actions earned them immense moral authority and popular legitimacy. Peasants, who had previously been wary of political involvement, now flocked to the Viet Minh, driven by desperation and a thirst for justice. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan, the Viet Minh intensified their preparations for a general uprising. Ho Chi Minh directed Vo Nguyen Giap to establish armed propaganda units, designed not only for military action, but also for political agitation among the populace. On December 22, 1944, Giap formed the Vietnam Propaganda and Liberation Army, the precursor to the modern People's Army of Vietnam. It began with just 34 men and a handful of weapons. Its first actions were successful raids on French outposts, demonstrating the Viet Minh's growing capacity for armed struggle. The stage was being set for a decisive moment. As the old imperial order crumbled under the weight of global conflict, the philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated with tragic clarity amidst the famine. The chains of the past now included not just colonial rule but the very structures that allowed millions to starve while food existed. The Viet Minh, by actively challenging this cruel reality, offered a vision of a future unbound. What depths of courage would be required to overcome such profound suffering and injustice? As World War II neared its conclusion, the strategic situation in Indochina became increasingly precarious for Imperial Japan. With American forces advancing across the Pacific and the threat of Allied landings in Southeast Asia growing, Tokyo became suspicious of the French colonial administration. Despite their earlier accommodation, the Japanese feared that the French, particularly those loyal to the Free French government of Charles de Gaulle, might switch allegiance and actively resist them, or at least facilitate an Allied invasion. To preempt such a move and secure their rear lines, Japan decided on a decisive, swift action. On March 9, 1945, the Japanese military launched a sudden coup d'état across Indochina. In a matter of hours, Japanese forces systematically disarmed and interned all French colonial troops and administrative personnel. The French hold, which had endured for nearly a century, crumbled with astonishing speed. Emperor Bao Dai, the nominal Vietnamese ruler under French suzerainty, was compelled to declare Vietnam's independence under Japanese protection, forming a puppet government. This act effectively removed the French from the immediate political landscape, but it did not grant true sovereignty to the Vietnamese people. Instead, it replaced one foreign master with another, arguably more ruthless one. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now being addressed by Nguyen Ai Quoc through concrete action. He was forging the tools to break those chains, not just through intellectual argument, but through the systematic organization of a revolutionary force. He was preparing his people not only for liberation from foreign rule, but also from the internal divisions and traditional structures that had historically hampered their unity. As he meticulously built his network, one question lingered: what sacrifices would these young men and their future generations be forced to make for the freedom he so relentlessly pursued? The fragile alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party in Canton collapsed in 1927. Chiang Kai-shek, the new leader of the KMT, after Sun Yat-sen's death, launched a brutal crackdown on communists, initiating a purge that decimated the CCP and forced its survivors into hiding. This abrupt shift in the political landscape in China directly impacted Nguyen Ai Quoc's operations. His base in Canton became untenable, and his life was once again in immediate danger. He was forced to flee, embarking on a perilous journey that took him through various parts of China, then to the Soviet Union, and eventually to Europe, disguised and constantly evading the relentless pursuit of French intelligence. This period of clandestine movement, from 1927 to 1930, was one of immense hardship and intellectual refinement for Nguyen Ai Quoc. he traveled through Thailand, where he organized Vietnamese expatriates and established revolutionary cells among them. He then moved through various European cities, attending international communist meetings, continuing his studies, and maintaining contact with the Comintern. Despite the constant threat and isolation, he remained dedicated to the cause, meticulously planning the next steps for the Vietnamese Revolution. He understood that the revolution needed a unified, disciplined party, capable of leading the masses and adapting to the complex political realities of Indochina. By the late 1920s, several disparate Vietnamese communist groups had emerged, both inside Vietnam and among expatriate communities. These groups, while sharing a common goal of independence, often operated in isolation, sometimes competing with each other. The Comintern, recognizing the need for unity and a coherent strategy, dispatched Nguyen Ai Quoc to Hong Kong in 1930, with a critical mandate to consolidate these factions into a single, unified Communist Party for Indochina. He understood the immense challenge this presented. Deeply ingrained ideological differences and personal rivalries had to be overcome. On February 3, 1930, in a modest room in Kowloon, Hong Kong, Nguyen Ai Quoc successfully presided over the unification conference of these disparate Vietnamese communist groups. This historic meeting resulted in the formation of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Vietnamese Communist Party, recognizing the broader colonial context and the need for a unified front across all of French Indochina. The party was soon renamed the Indochinese Communist Party (ICP) in October 1930. Nguyen Ai Quoc, despite his influential role in its formation, did not immediately assume its formal leadership, preferring to operate behind the scenes, guiding and advising while allowing others to take public positions. This reflected his strategic understanding of clandestine operations and his desire to build a collective leadership. The ICP's initial program, largely influenced by Nguyen Ai Quoc's vision, outlined a two-stage revolution. The first stage would focus on national liberation, overthrowing French imperialism and feudalism, and establishing an independent, democratic republic. The second stage, a socialist revolution, would then transition Vietnam towards communism. The party emphasized the crucial role of the peasantry as the primary revolutionary force, alongside the nascent working class. It called for land redistribution, democratic freedoms, and the abolition of oppressive taxes and colonial monopolies. This program, tailored to the specific conditions of Indochina, demonstrated Nguyen Ai Quoc's ability to apply Marxist theory flexibly and pragmatically. However, the French script remained a persistent threat. In June 1931, after a period of intense surveillance, Nguyen Ai Quoc was arrested by British authorities in Hong Kong at the request of the French. His arrest was a major blow to the nascent ICP, and the French believed they had finally captured their elusive adversary. He was imprisoned, and the French government immediately sought his extradition to Indochina, where he would undoubtedly face execution. What followed was a complex legal and diplomatic battle, spearheaded by a network of British lawyers and communist sympathizers who championed his cause, arguing against his extradition on humanitarian and political grounds. Despite the immense danger, Nguyen Ai Quoc maintained his composure in prison, continuing to study and plan. The legal battle dragged on for over 2 years, reaching the Privy Council in London, the highest court of appeal for the British Empire. Miraculously, in 1932, the Privy Council ruled in his favor, preventing his extradition. However, he remained in precarious health due to tuberculosis contracted in prison. Upon his release in early 1933, he was smuggled out of Hong Kong, feigning illness and even death to throw off French intelligence. He resurfaced in the Soviet Union, where he spent several years recovering, studying, and further consolidating his strategic vision for the Vietnamese Revolution. The philosophical question of whether a nation can ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past found a renewed urgency in the very formation of the ICP. The party was an attempt to forge a new future, free from the colonial past and the internal divisions that had historically plagued Vietnamese society. Yet, the price of this pursuit, as evidenced by Nguyen Ai Quoc's constant flight and imprisonment, was immeasurable. The future of Vietnam now rested on the resilience of this nascent party and the unwavering dedication of its leader. What price, then, would the world exact for such a pursuit of freedom? After his miraculous escape from Hong Kong in 1933, Nguyen Ai Quoc, once again using a new identity, resurfaced in the Soviet Union. His health, severely compromised by tuberculosis, contracted during his imprisonment, required extensive recovery. For several years, he underwent treatment and further ideological training, residing at the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow. This period, from 1934 to 1938, was one of relative quiet on the surface, but intense intellectual and strategic consolidation beneath. He observed the Soviet system from within, including the chilling waves of Stalin's Great Purge, which saw many old Bolsheviks and even some Comintern comrades disappear. This period of intense paranoia and elimination of dissent likely reinforced his pragmatic and cautious approach to leadership, emphasizing unity and the careful cultivation of cadres. He understood the immense power of a centralized party, but also the dangers of unchecked power. While in Moscow, he continued to refine his theories on colonial revolution, studying historical precedents and contemporary movements. He recognized that the success of the Vietnamese struggle would depend not only on military strength, but also on the ability to mobilize the entire population, peasants and workers alike. He meticulously analyzed the shifting geopolitical landscape, the rise of fascism in Europe, with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy openly challenging the established order, and the aggressive expansionism of Imperial Japan in Asia, created a new, volatile global environment. He saw these developments not just as external threats, but as potential opportunities for colonized nations. The impending global conflict, he reasoned, would inevitably weaken the colonial powers, creating a vacuum that an organized revolutionary movement could exploit. By the late 1930s, the Comintern, under pressure from the growing fascist threat, shifted its strategy from immediate world revolution to forming popular fronts, broad alliances with non-communists, anti-fascist forces. This strategic pivot aligned well with Nguyen Ai Quoc's pragmatic approach. He had always believed in the necessity of a broad national front to achieve independence, bringing together all classes and patriotic elements, even those who were not communists, to fight the common enemy, colonialism. This flexibility was a hallmark of his leadership, distinguishing him from more rigid ideologues. He was not bound by dogma, but driven by the practical imperative of national liberation. With the international situation growing increasingly tense, Nguyen Ai Quoc began to make preparations for his return to Southeast Asia. In 1938, he traveled back to China, where the Second Sino-Japanese War was already raging. He re-established contact with Vietnamese revolutionary groups, operating clandestinely, guiding them, and preparing them for the decisive moment. He adopted new aliases, including Ho Quang, working within a Chinese nationalist army unit near the Vietnamese border, ostensibly as a journalist or secretary, while secretly training and organizing Vietnamese cadres. He meticulously planned his re-entry into Vietnam, understanding that his physical presence in the homeland was essential to directly lead the burgeoning independence movement. However, the Japanese coup inadvertently created a crucial power vacuum. While the French administration had been crushed, the Japanese lacked the manpower and the desire to establish a deep, pervasive administrative control over every village and district, especially in the remote northern regions. They focused primarily on strategic urban centers and vital transportation routes. This sudden rupture of colonial authority, combined with the widespread suffering caused by the famine, presented the Viet Minh with an unparalleled opportunity. Ho Chi Minh, receiving news of the coup from his mountain hideout in Pac Bo, immediately recognized this as the pivotal moment he had meticulously prepared for over decades. He issued urgent directives to Viet Minh cadres across the country. The time for a general uprising has come. His strategic insight was profound. He understood that the Japanese, though powerful, were stretched thin and facing defeat elsewhere. He also knew that the Vietnamese people, exhausted by famine and dual oppression, were ripe for revolution. The directive called for disarming Japanese and puppet forces where possible, and establishing revolutionary committees at local levels. The emphasis was on immediate action, seizing the initiative before any new stable authority could be established by either the Japanese or the returning allies. Across the northern and central parts of Vietnam, the Viet Minh network, built patiently over years, sprang into action. Local cadres, often with the support of newly armed peasants, quickly took control of villages and districts. They raided Japanese and French armories, acquiring vital weapons. Popular committees were formed. Land was sometimes redistributed from landlords, and a rudimentary form of revolutionary governance began to emerge. The sight of the French being disarmed by the Japanese, previously unimaginable, boosted the morale of the Vietnamese people and shattered the myth of French invincibility. The Viet Minh capitalized on this psychological shift, presenting themselves as the legitimate liberators. During this period, a pragmatic and temporary alliance emerged between the Viet Minh and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The Americans, focused solely on defeating Japan, saw the Viet Minh as a useful, indigenous force capable of gathering intelligence on Japanese movements and rescuing downed Allied pilots. Ho Chi Minh, ever the pragmatist, embraced this cooperation. He provided intelligence and assistance to the OSS, even rescuing an American pilot, Lieutenant Charles Fenn. In return, the OSS provided the Viet Minh with limited weapons, training, and medical supplies. Ho Chi Minh also used this opportunity to present the Viet Minh as a legitimate nationalist movement seeking independence, hoping to gain American support for his post-war vision of a free Vietnam, independent of both French and Japanese control. He provided the OSS with a copy of Vietnam's Declaration of Independence, drawing heavily from the American Declaration. However, American policymakers, far removed from the ground realities of Vietnam, largely misunderstood Ho Chi Minh's long-term communist intentions, viewing him primarily as an anti-Japanese nationalist. The final push came rapidly. In August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Imperial Japan faced inevitable defeat. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. This news ignited the fuse that Ho Chi Minh had meticulously laid. Before any Allied forces could arrive to re-establish order or empower old colonial masters, the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution. In a stunning display of coordinated popular uprising, Viet Minh-led committees and armed groups seized control of major cities and towns across Vietnam. Hanoi on August 19th, Hue on August 23rd, and Saigon on August 25th. The Japanese, demoralized and awaiting orders from Tokyo, offered little resistance. Emperor Bao Dai, facing the overwhelming popular will, abdicated, handing over the imperial seal and sword to Viet Minh representatives. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now being answered with astonishing momentum. The past chains of French colonial rule and Japanese occupation were being violently cast off by the unified will of the Vietnamese people. But the echoes of that past, and the seeds of future conflict, were not yet fully silenced. What new and unforeseen chains would now emerge from this moment of triumph? The triumph of the August Revolution culminated in a moment of profound historical significance. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's historic Ba Dinh Square, before a massive crowd of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people, Ho Chi Minh, now the president of the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, stepped forward. His voice, clear and resonant despite his frail health, delivered the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. It was a meticulously crafted document, beginning with a powerful echo of the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He then referenced the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, subtly turning the ideals of the colonial powers against them. Ho Chi Minh systematically listed the litany of French colonial abuses, their denial of democratic freedoms, their economic exploitation, their fostering of division, their brutal suppression of dissent, and their callous indifference during the recent famine. He declared that Vietnam had broken off all relations of a colonial character with France, and abolished all the privileges wrung by the French from our motherland. The moment was charged with an almost impossible hope. After 80 years of direct French rule and 5 years under Japanese occupation, Vietnam was, by its own proclamation, free. American OSS officers who had assisted the Viet Minh against the Japanese stood on the dais, inadvertently lending a symbolic, if ultimately fleeting, veneer of international legitimacy to the declaration. Ho Chi Minh's vision for this newly independent Vietnam was of a unified, democratic nation, free from foreign interference and dedicated to the welfare of its people. He initially sought recognition and aid from the international community, particularly from the United States, believing that President Roosevelt's anti-colonial stance might translate into support for Vietnam's independence. He dispatched letters and appeals to Washington outlining Vietnam's aspirations and emphasizing the shared ideals of self-determination. He genuinely hoped that a new world order, free from the old imperialistic habits, would emerge from the ashes of World War II. However, the reality on the ground was far more complex and immediately threatened Vietnam's nascent independence. The Potsdam Conference of July 1945 had BAT, without Vietnamese consultation, divided Indochina into two zones for Allied occupation and disarmament of Japanese troops. The Chinese Kuomintang, under General Lu Han, would occupy the north of the 16th parallel, and British forces under General Douglas Gracey would occupy the south. These Allied forces arrived shortly after the Declaration of Independence, bringing with them conflicting agendas that swiftly extinguished Ho Chi Minh's hopes for an easy transition to full sovereignty. In the north, some 200,000 Chinese Kuomintang troops poured across the border. While they were ostensibly there to disarm the Japanese, their presence was chaotic and rapacious. They plundered the local economy, extorted money, and supported various anti-Viet Minh Vietnamese nationalist factions who were often more concerned with settling old scores against the communists than with achieving genuine national unity. Ho Chi Minh, faced with this overwhelming force and the threat of internal fragmentation, was forced to make pragmatic, painful concessions to maintain the Viet Minh's precarious hold on power and prevent a direct confrontation with the Chinese. In the south, the situation quickly deteriorated into outright conflict. British forces, arriving in Saigon, immediately began to facilitate the return of the French. General Gracey, overtly hostile to Vietnamese independence, released French troops who had been interned by the Japanese and armed them. On September 23, 1945, exactly 3 weeks after Ho Chi Minh's declaration, French forces, with British support, launched an attack to retake administrative control of Saigon, effectively initiating the First Indochina War. General Jean-Philippe Leclerc, commander of French forces, soon arrived with reinforcements, openly declaring France's intention to re-establish its colonial authority. This immediate dual threat, the rapacious Chinese and their Vietnamese proxies in the north, and the returning French in the south, forced Ho Chi Minh to engage in a delicate and dangerous game of political maneuvering. He recognized that fighting both at once was impossible. His pragmatic choice was to temporarily accommodate the French in the north, to rid Vietnam of the Chinese, betting that he could then fight the French on more favorable terms. This led to complex negotiations and alliances, as Ho Chi Minh prioritized the long-term goal of complete independence over immediate ideological purity or tactical advantages. He signed agreements with the French in early 1946, allowing their return to the north in exchange for recognition of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. Knowing full well that this was a temporary measure, the philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated with stark irony. Vietnam had declared its freedom, but the chains of past colonial agreements, Potsdam, lingering imperial ambitions France, and new power plays China, immediately sought to rebind it. The cost of this fleeting independence, secured for a mere 21 days before the French onslaught in the south, was immeasurable. How long could such a fragile freedom endure against the determined forces of empire? The initial agreements signed between Ho Chi Minh's provisional government and France in early 1946 were for the Vietnamese a desperate gamble for peace, and a means to dislodge the occupying Chinese Kuomintang forces. The March 6, 1946, accord recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, with its own army and parliament, but it carefully avoided the word independence. This ambiguity proved to be a fatal flaw. Ho Chi Minh understood it as a temporary compromise, a stepping stone to full sovereignty. The French, however, interpreted it as a tactical maneuver to reassert their authority, hoping to regain control piece by piece. In the summer of 1946, Ho Chi Minh himself traveled to France, leading a Vietnamese delegation for the Fontainebleau Conference, aimed at negotiating a definitive treaty. For 4 months, he engaged in tireless diplomacy in Paris, attempting to persuade French politicians of the wisdom of recognizing Vietnam's independence and building a new relationship based on equality. He appealed to their republican ideals, their own revolutionary history, and even their economic scepticism, arguing that a willing, independent Vietnam would be a better partner than a resentful, subjugated colony. His efforts, however, met with stubborn resistance from a French government deeply entrenched in its colonial mindset, unwilling to relinquish what it still considered its overseas patrimony. French negotiators deliberately stalled, offered minimal concessions, and ultimately refused to grant true independence or unify Vietnam under Viet Minh rule. Frustrated but unwilling to return home empty, Ho Chi Minh signed a temporary modus vivendi on September 14, 1946. This agreement was less than he had hoped for, offering some economic and cultural concessions but deferring the critical political questions of independence and unification. Upon his return, he faced skepticism from within his own party, but he calmly explained the necessity of tactical retreat, stating, "It is better to smell the French excrement for a while than to eat Chinese excrement for the rest of our lives." He knew that war was now almost inevitable, but he wanted to exhaust every diplomatic avenue, both to legitimize the future armed struggle and to gain crucial time for the Viet Minh to prepare. While Ho Chi Minh was engaged in diplomacy, French military forces in Indochina, under the command of General Zhang Etienne Vallée, were aggressively reasserting their control. In the south, they systematically dismantled Viet Minh administrative structures, often with brutal force, and propped up puppet governance, creating a separate, French-controlled autonomous Republic of Cochinchina. In the north, French troops, now free from the Chinese presence, began to move into key urban centers, leading to increasing friction with Viet Minh forces. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension, with sporadic clashes and incidents escalating daily. The flashpoint came in late November 1946 in the port city of Haiphong. A dispute over customs control escalated into a full-blown confrontation. On November 23, 1946, French warships, without warning, opened fire on the Vietnamese quarter of Haiphong, shelling civilian areas indiscriminately. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians were killed in this brutal bombardment. This act of aggression, a clear violation of the modus vivendi and an unprovoked slaughter, extinguished any remaining hope for a peaceful resolution. It was a deliberate French provocation, designed to force the Viet Minh's hand and reassert colonial authority through overwhelming force. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh leadership realized that there was no longer any path to independence through negotiation. The choice was clear: fight or submit. On December 19, 1946, Ho Chi Minh issued his nationwide appeal for sacred resistance. From a secret location outside Hanoi, his voice, broadcast over radio, called upon every Vietnamese man and woman, regardless of age or background, to take up arms against the French aggressors. "Those who have rifles will use their rifles," he declared. "Those who have swords will use their swords. If they have no swords, they will use spades, hoes, or sticks." He acknowledged the immense disparity in power, but stressed the righteousness of their cause and the strength of a united people. Following this call, Viet Minh forces in Hanoi launched an attack on French positions, beginning a desperate but ultimately futile attempt to hold the capital. This engagement marked the official beginning of the First Indochina War. Knowing that they could not withstand the superior French firepower in open urban warfare, the Viet Minh executed a strategic withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness and fighting fierce rearguard actions, they systematically evacuated their cadres and equipment from Hanoi and other cities, retreating into the dense jungles and remote mountainous regions of Viet Bse. This strategic retreat was not a defeat but a deliberate move to preserve their forces and prepare for a protracted guerrilla war, a strategy they had studied and adapted from Chinese communist revolutionary theory, particularly from Mao Zedong's writings. On protracted People's War, they would use the vast inhospitable terrain of Vietnam to their advantage, wearing down the enemy through attrition, gaining popular support, and building up their strength for a decisive future engagement. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated with the thunder of French artillery in Haiphong. The past, in the form of colonial ambition, had returned with brutal force, attempting to reimpose its chains. Yet, in the jungles of Viet Bc, a nation, under the determined leadership of Ho Chi Minh, was actively forging a new path, choosing struggle over submission. What immense suffering would now be inflicted on a people determined to break free. The Viet Minh's strategic retreat into the rugged mountains of Viet Bc in late 1946 marked the true commencement of the First Indochina War. Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap understood that conventional warfare against the technologically superior French Expeditionary Corps was suicidal. Instead, they embraced the doctrine of protracted people's war, a strategy of attrition designed to wear down the enemy through a combination of political struggle, economic disruption, and guerrilla warfare. From their hidden bases, deep within the jungle and mountains, the Viet Minh began to systematically build their strength. The early years of the war, roughly from 1947 to 1949, were characterized by small-scale, decentralized actions. Viet Minh units, typically operating in platoons or companies, engaged in ambushes on French convoys, sabotaged infrastructure like bridges and railway lines, and launched swift hit-and-run raids on isolated French outposts. Their strength lay in their intimate knowledge of the terrain, their ability to blend seamlessly with the civilian population, and their unwavering determination. Every villager in the areas controlled by the Viet Minh was considered a potential combatant or supporter. They provided intelligence on French movements, hid Viet Minh soldiers, supplied food, and carried supplies along arduous mountain trails. This symbiotic relationship between the Viet Minh fighters and the peasantry was the bedrock of their people's war. The French, despite their superior firepower, found themselves in an increasingly frustrating and costly conflict. Their forces, though well equipped with modern weapons, tanks, and air support, were constantly bogged down by the challenging terrain, the dense jungle, and an elusive enemy that struck from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. They relied on static garrisons and cumbersome search-and-destroy operations that often yielded little result but alienated the very population they claimed to be protecting. The war became a drain on French resources, both financial and human, and its unpopularity grew steadily within France itself, where public opinion increasingly questioned the morality and viability of re-establishing colonial rule. Under the astute leadership of Vo Nguyen Giap, the People's Army of Vietnam, though still largely a guerrilla force, began a process of gradual professionalization. Hidden training camps were established deep in the jungle, where recruits were drilled in military tactics, political education, and logistics. Weapons, often crude and locally manufactured, were supplemented by captured French arms. Giap emphasized discipline, self-reliance, and the importance of maintaining the absolute loyalty of the peasantry. The Viet Minh built rudimentary supply lines, often relying on human porters carrying provisions over hundreds of kilometers. They were learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each passing month, turning their weaknesses into strengths. A monumental strategic shift occurred in 1949 with the victory of Mao Zedong's Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. Establishment of the People's Republic of China on Vietnam's northern border was a geopolitical game-changer. For years, the Viet Minh had been isolated, dependent on captured arms and limited internal production. Now, a direct overland route to a powerful communist ally was open. China, newly liberated, immediately began to provide the Viet Minh with significant military aid, modern artillery, small arms, ammunition, and critical logistical support. Chinese military advisors also arrived to help train Viet Minh forces in more conventional tactics, transforming them from a purely guerrilla force into a more capable semi-regular army. This infusion of external support allowed the Viet Minh to contemplate larger, more ambitious military operations. The conflict, initially framed as a purely colonial war, began to take on the chilling dimensions of the nascent Cold War. The United States, initially hesitant to support the re-establishment of European colonialism, increasingly viewed the Indochina conflict through the lens of containing global communism. As China became communists, and with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, Washington's policy shifted. The US began providing substantial financial and military aid to France, seeing the French effort in Indochina as a vital bulwark against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This external intervention would prolong and intensify the conflict for years to come. Despite the growing external support for the French, the morale and capabilities of the Viet Minh continued their upward trajectory. By late 1949 and early 1950, they were no longer just reacting to French offensives. They were planning and executing their own. They began to challenge French strongholds along the Chinese border, demonstrating their newfound ability to fight larger-scale engagements. The tide of the war was beginning to turn, slowly but inexorably, in favor of the Vietnamese revolutionaries. The pride in their growing strength, the intensity of their commitment, and the unstoppable momentum of their cause were palpable across the liberated zones. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated profoundly as the Vietnamese, fighting with ingenuity and resilience, demonstrated their will to break not only from colonial chains, but also from the limitations of their own historical context. They were forging a new future, one bloody battle at a time. The echoes of their struggle called out across the world. Would you have heard their growing roar from the jungle, a people rising? The victory of the Chinese communists in late 1949 and the subsequent opening of a secure overland supply route from China fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the First Indochina War. For the Viet Minh, this was a lifeline, transforming their capabilities from a resilient guerrilla force into a formidable army, no longer dependent solely on captured arms or rudimentary domestic production. They now received consistent shipments of modern weaponry, ammunition, and vital supplies from their communist allies. Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap understood that the time was ripe to shift from purely defensive guerrilla warfare to more conventional large-scale offensives. The first major test of the Viet Minh's enhanced capabilities came in October 1950 with the Border Campaign. The target was the chain of French garrisons along Route Colonial for RC4, a strategic road running near the Chinese border. These outposts, designed to block Viet Minh's supply lines, were now vulnerable. The most significant engagement was the Battle of Dong Qui. Viet Minh forces, employing artillery and large infantry formations, launched a coordinated assault on the isolated French fort at Dong Qui. After a brutal multi-day battle, the French garrison was overrun and annihilated. This was not a hit-and-run raid. It was a sustained, conventional siege and assault, demonstrating the Viet Minh's newfound capacity for offensive operations. The fall of Dong Qui sent shockwaves through the French High Command. General Marcel Carpentier, the French commander-in-chief, ordered the evacuation of other vulnerable garrisons along RC4, most notably Cao Bang. The retreat quickly devolved into a chaotic rout. Viet Minh forces ambushed the retreating columns, inflicting devastating casualties. Thousands of French and colonial troops were killed, captured, or simply disappeared into the jungle. It was a catastrophic defeat, equivalent to a major military disaster. The Border Campaign secured a direct, unmolested supply corridor from China, allowing a continuous flow of aid and reinforcements, solidifying the Viet Minh's control over a significant portion of northern Vietnam. It marked a decisive turning point in the war, demonstrating that the Viet Minh were no longer merely a nuisance, but a force capable of inflicting massive defeats on the French. The French military and political establishment in Paris was stunned. The illusion of an easy, swift victory, which had persisted despite years of fighting, shattered. They realized the nature of the war had fundamentally changed. They were no longer facing a disorganized insurgency, but an increasingly professional army, backed by a major power. Casualties mounted, and the financial drain on the French treasury became unsustainable. Morale plummeted among the expeditionary corps, who found themselves fighting a brutal, thankless war in a hostile environment, far from home. The growing political unpopularity of the war in France added further pressure in an attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. The French dispatched General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny to Indochina in December 1950. De Lattre was a charismatic and highly decorated commander. Known for his leadership during World War II, he immediately set about restoring morale, reorganizing the French forces, and implementing a new defensive strategy. He built a chain of concrete bunkers and strongpoints around the Red River Delta, creating a formidable defensive perimeter to protect Hanoi and its vital agricultural lands. His dynamic presence initially had a positive effect. In early 1951, Viet Minh attempts to breach his new defensive lines at Van Nuyen, Mao Key, and the Day River were repulsed with heavy losses for Giap's forces. These initial setbacks forced Ho Chi Minh and Giap to make tactical adjustments. While the border campaign had proven their conventional capabilities, de Lattre's hedgehog defenses showed that over-reliance on direct frontal assaults against prepared positions was still too costly. The Viet Minh temporarily reverted to smaller-scale guerrilla actions, focusing on intelligence gathering, logistics, and further strengthening their rural bases, while continuing to build up their main forces and train them in more sophisticated tactics. This adaptability was another hallmark of the Viet Minh's leadership, learning from both victories and defeats. Amidst these military developments, the Cold War cast an ever-darkening shadow over Indochina. The United States, having initially been wary of French colonialism, now viewed the conflict almost entirely through the lens of containing communism. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950, heightened Washington's fears of a monolithic communist expansion. France, a crucial NATO ally, leveraged these fears to secure massive financial and military aid from the US. By 1952, the United States was financing a significant portion of the French war effort in Indochina, providing equipment, supplies, and financial backing, effectively prolonging a conflict that might otherwise have ended much sooner. This aid, however, came with strings, increasingly pushing the French to commit to holding Indochina as a bulwark against communism, rather than focusing on a political solution. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated with the thunder of artillery along RC4 and the increasing flow of foreign aid. The chains of French colonialism were being violently tested by Vietnamese resolve, but new chains, forged in the fires of the Cold War and international ideological struggle, were already being tightened around the conflict. This was no longer just a war for independence. It was becoming a proxy battlefield for global powers. What profound betrayals, then, would such entangled interests inevitably bring? General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny's dynamic leadership, while providing a temporary boost to French morale and achieving some defensive successes in early 1951, proved to be tragically short-lived. In late 1951, he was diagnosed with cancer. His health rapidly deteriorated, forcing his return to France, where he died in January 1952. His departure left a profound void in the French High Command in Indochina. No subsequent commander could quite replicate his charisma or strategic vision, and the French Expeditionary Corps once again found itself struggling with flagging morale and a lack of clear strategic direction. Following de Lattre's departure, French strategy became increasingly reactive and fragmented. They attempted to solidify their control over the Red River Delta, launching pacification campaigns and trying to establish a more stable pro-French Vietnamese government. However, their efforts were consistently undermined by the pervasive influence of the Viet Minh, who continued their political agitation and guerrilla actions even within supposedly secure areas. The French also sought to draw the Viet Minh into large, conventional engagements, hoping to leverage their superior firepower and air support. A notable attempt was the Battle of Nha San in late 1952, where the French successfully defended a fortified camp against a major Viet Minh assault. While a tactical victory for the French, it highlighted the immense logistical challenges of supplying such outposts deep in Viet Minh territory and the heavy cost of defending them. It also inadvertently provided the Viet Minh with valuable lessons on besieging fortified positions. Simultaneously, the Viet Minh, under Ho Chi Minh's and Giap's guidance, continued to expand their liberated zones, pushing deeper into the remote areas of northern Vietnam and establishing new bases of support. Their political mobilization efforts intensified, reaching an even wider segment of the peasantry. Crucially, their logistical capabilities, while rudimentary, became remarkably efficient. Thousands upon thousands of civilian porters, often women and children, carried supplies, rice, ammunition, medical equipment, and even disassembled artillery pieces on their backs or on specially modified bicycles, along hidden trails and through dense jungle. This human supply chain, often moving at night to avoid French air surveillance, proved to be virtually invulnerable to conventional interdiction and was a strategic advantage the French gravely underestimated. Back in metropolitan France, political instability was rampant. Governments rose and fell with alarming frequency, each new cabinet grappling with the unpopular and increasingly costly war in Indochina. public opinion grew weary of the endless casualties and the drain on the national treasury. The war was seen by many as a drain that diverted resources from rebuilding France after World War II and from its commitments in Europe. This mounting domestic pressure created an urgent demand for a decisive military victory that could either force a favorable negotiated settlement or allow for an honorable withdrawal. It was in this context that General Henry Navarre was appointed Commander-in-Chief of French forces in Indochina in May 1953, tasked with finding a way out of the stalemate. Navarre devised a plan that he believed would lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle where French firepower could decisively defeat them. His strategy, known as the Navarre Plan, involved a series of strategic maneuvers, consolidating forces in the Red River Delta, then expanding control in the south, and finally, establishing a heavily fortified airland base in the remote northwestern highlands to block Viet Minh incursions into Laos and draw Giap's main forces into a decisive confrontation. The location chosen for this fortified base was Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley near the Laotian border. French strategists believed its isolated location, accessible only by air, made it a natural trap for the Viet Minh, who would be forced to besiege it in conventional style, exposing themselves to overwhelming French air power and artillery. They intended to create an airland base that could be supplied and reinforced by air, while denying the Viet Minh access to key logistical routes. The plan was based on the premise that the Viet Minh lacked the heavy artillery and the logistical capacity to sustain a prolonged siege against such a well-defended position. Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen, observing the French build-up at Dien Bien Phu, recognized the immense gamble Navarre was taking. It was a tempting target, a fixed position that could be encircled and cut off. After careful deliberation and extensive planning, they made the audacious decision to accept the challenge. They believed that by concentrating all their available forces and overcoming monumental logistical obstacles, they could turn Dien Bien Phu into a graveyard for the French Expeditionary Corps. The order was given for a massive secret mobilization of manpower and resources to prepare for the siege. This decision set the stage for the most pivotal battle of the First Indochina War. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, echoed with a terrible urgency in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu. The chains of colonial arrogance, of underestimation, of the belief in technological superiority, were being forged in the very stronghold meant to secure victory. Yet, the Vietnamese, through sheer human will and an incredible logistical effort, were about to demonstrate that the chains of the past could be broken by a relentless, unified future. What unspeakable suffering would now descend upon this isolated valley, a microcosm of an entire nation's desperate struggle. The remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, chosen by General Henry Navarre as the site for his decisive battle, became a focal point of French colonial ambition and military might. Over several months in late 1953 and early 1954, the French transformed the valley into a formidable airland base. They constructed a network of fortified strong points, each given a female name: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Eliane, Claudine, Isabelle, scattered across the valley floor and on the surrounding hills. These positions were heavily defended with barbed wire, minefields, machine guns, and artillery. The French confidently believed their air superiority, ensuring continuous resupply and troop reinforcement by air, and their superior firepower would make Dien Bien Phu impregnable. Their assessment of the Viet Minh's ability to bring heavy weaponry and sustain a prolonged siege was tragically flawed. Bordering on dismissive, they underestimated the tenacity, ingenuity, and sheer human will of their adversary. Meanwhile, for the Viet Minh, the preparation for the siege of Dien Bien Phu was an undertaking of epic proportions, a testament to their logistical genius and the unwavering commitment of their people. Under the meticulous direction of Vo Nguyen Giap, and with the constant strategic oversight of Ho Chi Minh, hundreds of thousands of civilian laborers, primarily peasants, were mobilized. They worked tirelessly, often under extreme conditions, to transport enormous quantities of supplies, weapons, and ammunition to the distant battlefield. Food, medicine, artillery shells, and even disassembled heavy artillery pieces were carried on modified bicycles, their frames reinforced to bear loads of over 200 kilograms, or on the backs of individual porters along newly cut jungle trails. and through treacherous mountainous terrain. This human supply chain stretched for hundreds of kilometers, defying French air surveillance and bombing raids. Roads were built and repaired at night, camouflaged by day. Artillery pieces, some weighing several tons, were painstakingly pulled up steep hillsides by teams of thousands of volunteers, or disassembled, carried in pieces, and then reassembled in cunningly concealed positions overlooking the French base. Secrecy was paramount. The entire operation was conducted with a discipline that astounded future military analysts. The individual porters and volunteers, many suffering from malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion, were driven by an unshakable belief in their cause, fueled by the knowledge that their efforts were directly contributing to the liberation of their homeland. Their silent, collective effort represented an unparalleled mobilization of a nation's will. By early March 1954, the Viet Minh had silently encircled Dien Bien Phu. Their artillery, long thought impossible to deploy in such terrain, was now dug into carefully concealed bomb-proof bunkers on the surrounding hillsides, aiming directly down into the French positions. A vast network of trenches and tunnels had been painstakingly dug, allowing Viet Minh infantry to approach the French strongpoints under cover, effectively negating the French advantage of open terrain and observation. The French, confident in their airland base, remained largely oblivious to the scale of the Viet Minh preparations until it was too late. Their aerial reconnaissance had failed to detect the vast human effort that had put Giap's forces in such a commanding position. The battle for Dien Bien Phu began on March 13, 1954, at precisely 5 p.m. A deafening roar erupted from the surrounding hills as hundreds of Viet Minh artillery pieces, firing simultaneously, unleashed a devastating barrage on the French. The initial target was Beatrice, the northernmost French position held by the crack Foreign Legion. The bombardment was far more intense and accurate than the French had ever anticipated. French counter-battery fire proved largely ineffective, as the Viet Minh artillery was perfectly camouflaged and often moved after firing. Within hours of the initial bombardment, Viet Minh infantry, pouring out of their trenches, launched human wave assaults on Beatrice and Gabrielle. The ferocity and determination of the attacks stunned the French defenders. Beatrice fell on the first night, its commander dead, its garrison annihilated. Gabrielle, though putting up a heroic defense, succumbed 2 days later. The speed and savagery of these initial assaults, coupled with the relentless and accurate artillery fire, immediately shattered French morale and their illusion of impregnability. The main airstrip, vital for French resupply, was quickly rendered unusable, forcing all supplies to be parachuted in, an increasingly hazardous undertaking under continuous Viet Minh fire. The French command, initially confident, suddenly grasped the terrible reality of their predicament. Their entire strategic calculation had been based on a profound underestimation of the Viet Minh's capabilities, particularly their artillery and logistical prowess. The chaos and grief descended swiftly upon the isolated garrison. The silence of the jungle was now replaced by the thunder of cannons and the cries of the wounded. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now being answered in the hellish confines of Dien Bien Phu. The chains of colonial arrogance, of underestimation, were being violently broken by a people who refused to be bound. What profound and irreversible consequences would this brutal awakening bring after the initial, devastating assaults that secured Beatrice and Gabrielle? The Battle of Dien Bien Phu settled into a grueling, prolonged siege. It became a subterranean war of attrition, fought in a landscape transformed into a lunar wasteland of shell craters, mud, and shattered defenses. The Viet Minh, with their vast labor force, continuously extended their network of trenches, slowly strangling the French strongpoints, cutting off their lines of communication, and bringing their forces ever closer. This relentless digging, often under French artillery fire and air attack, allowed them to launch successive waves of infantry assaults from concealed positions, gradually eroding the French perimeter. Conditions within the besieged French garrison rapidly deteriorated. Constant artillery bombardment turned the valley floor into a quagmire, especially with the onset of the monsoon season. Trenches became waterlogged, bunkers collapsed, and the wounded lay in desperate conditions. Disease, particularly dysentery and malaria, spread rampantly. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers, cut off and constantly under fire, suffered from exhaustion, fear, and a growing sense of hopelessness. They watched helplessly as their perimeter shrank, their comrades fell, and the promised relief never arrived. The French reliance on air supply became their critical vulnerability. As the Viet Minh tightened their encirclement, their anti-aircraft batteries, initially underestimated, became increasingly effective. Flights into Dien Bien Phu's increasingly battered airstrip became suicidal missions. Eventually, the airstrip was rendered unusable, forcing all supplies, ammunition, and medical personnel to be parachuted into the shrinking French positions, often landing outside the perimeter and falling into Viet Minh hands. French attempts at ground relief operations, such as Operation Condor from Laos, were too little, too late, and failed to break through the impenetrable Viet Minh lines. The battle became a desperate race against time, intricately linked to international diplomacy. The Geneva Conference on Indochina, scheduled to begin in late April 1954, loomed large. Both sides understood that the outcome of the battle would dictate the terms of any negotiated settlement. For the French, a victory at Dien Bien Phu might salvage their colonial claims. For the Viet Minh, a decisive triumph would shatter French resolve and fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape, forcing a complete withdrawal. As the situation at Dien Bien Phu grew increasingly dire, the United States, which was by then financing nearly 80% of the French war effort, engaged in a heated internal debate about direct military intervention. Proposals for Operation Vulture, which included massive American airstrikes against Viet Minh positions around Dien Bien Phu, even involving the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, was seriously considered. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, advocated for intervention, fearing the domino effect of a communist victory in Indochina. However, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a seasoned military strategist, ultimately decided against direct intervention. He insisted on two crucial conditions for U.S. involvement: a request from the French for intervention which was slow to materialize with political caveats, and, more importantly, the participation and support of key allies, particularly Great Britain. When London demurred, reluctant to be drawn into another colonial war, Eisenhower chose caution. Recognizing the immense risks of a land war in Asia so soon after the Korean conflict, he understood that unilateral action could lead to a far larger, more protracted commitment. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap maintained relentless pressure on the besieged French garrison. Despite heavy casualties among their own forces, they exhibited unwavering resolve. Giap, commanding the forces directly, meticulously planned each assault, adapting tactics based on the lessons learned, and ensuring that his troops, though suffering, remained supplied and committed. Ho Chi Minh, from his hidden command post, provided strategic direction and, perhaps more importantly, an unshakable moral compass, constantly reinforcing the righteousness of their cause and the imminent promise of national liberation. They understood that the end was near, and every sacrifice brought them closer to their ultimate goal. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was being answered in the mud and blood of Dien Bien Phu. The chains of colonial power, symbolized by the desperate French strongpoints, were being systematically dismantled by the sheer, unyielding will of a colonized people. The chaos and grief, not just of the battle itself but of an empire's final, desperate gasp, hung heavy in the air. What haunting silence would settle over the land once the fighting ceased? As the month of May 1954 began, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, battered and besieged for nearly 2 months, teetered on the brink of collapse. The monsoon rains had turned the valley into a muddy swamp, rendering bunkers useless and trenches filled with putrid water. Disease, exhaustion, and the relentless Viet Minh shelling had decimated the defenders. The remaining strongpoints, especially the key hills of Elian and Huguet, were reduced to ruins, held by a handful of desperate, exhausted men. Despite the appalling conditions, French soldiers, many of them foreign legionnaires and colonial troops, fought with a grim determination, but their resources were spent, and their morale, once bolstered by promises of relief, had crumbled. On May 1, 1954, Vo Nguyen Giap launched a final, overwhelming assault. Under cover of a massive artillery barrage, Viet Minh infantry, in successive human waves, swarmed the remaining French positions. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle for every bunker and every meter of ground. The French counterattacks, though valiant, lacked the strength and coordination to stem the tide. Strong points fell one by one. The sounds of battle were continuous. The roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the explosion of grenades, and the cries of the wounded and dying. The climax arrived on May 7, 1954, as dawn broke. Viet Minh forces, having breached the final outer defenses, surged into the central command post. The last remaining French strongpoints, including Eliane too, the symbol of the desperate defense, were overrun. At 5:30 p.m., the French command post at Dien Bien Phu ceased radio transmissions. General Christian de Castries, the garrison commander, ordered the destruction of remaining equipment and the raising of a white flag. A Viet Minh soldier, leading the final charge, hoisted the red and gold star flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam atop the bunker of General de Castries. The silence that followed the cessation of hostilities was profound, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the distant echoes of victory celebrations from the Viet Minh lines. The scale of the French defeat was immense and humiliating. Of approximately 16,000 French Union troops engaged in the battle, nearly 3,000 were killed or went missing, and over 10,000 were taken prisoner. Thousands of these prisoners, many severely wounded, were forced to endure brutal, protracted marches to distant Viet Minh prison camps, where disease and starvation claimed the lives of an estimated two-thirds of them. The image of a major colonial power, equipped with modern technology and supported by the West, being decisively defeated by a peasant army using ingenuity and sheer will, sent shockwaves across the globe. In France, the news of Dien Bien Phu's fall caused widespread shock, national humiliation, and political upheaval. The government of Prime Minister Joseph Lanille immediately collapsed. The defeat signaled the irreversible end of French colonial ambitions in Indochina and profoundly impacted its other colonial possessions. It became a powerful symbol for anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, demonstrating that even the mightiest imperial powers could be defeated by determined, organized liberation struggles. The myth of European military invincibility was shattered. The timing of the battle's conclusion could not have been more impactful on the Geneva Conference, which had convened in late April, precisely to address the future of Indochina. The fall of Dien Bien Phu on May 7th, just as the conference delegates were assembling, completely altered the negotiating landscape. The French delegation, utterly demoralized and facing an insurmountable military defeat, lost all leverage. The Viet Minh, riding the wave of their historic victory, found their position dramatically strengthened. The battle dictated the terms of the peace, not the diplomacy. Ho Chi Minh, from his command center, received news of the victory with characteristic calm. He understood the immense strategic significance of Dien Bien Phu. It was not merely a military victory. It was a political earthquake that would reshape the destiny of Vietnam and inspire anti-colonial movements worldwide. Yet in his quiet triumph, he also recognized that this was not the end of the struggle for true freedom, but merely the end of one bloody chapter. The path ahead remained fraught with danger, and new challenges to Vietnam's hard-won sovereignty were already beginning to emerge from the evolving geopolitical landscape. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was answered in the silence that followed the final gunshots at Dien Bien Phu. The chains of colonial subjugation, forged over generations, had been broken by an unimaginable act of collective will and sacrifice. Yet, the chaos, grief, and the profound silence left by the fallen, both victors and vanquished, suggested that even liberation carried an unbearable cost. How much blood then was spilled for this fleeting moment of triumph? The thunderous fall of Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954, sent immediate and irreversible shockwaves through the ongoing Geneva Conference on Indochina. What had begun as complex multilateral negotiations, with various powers maneuvering for advantage, instantly transformed into a conference dictated by the Viet Minh's military triumph. The French delegation, utterly demoralized, had no choice but to negotiate from a position of profound weakness. The United States, though providing massive financial aid to France, was unwilling to commit its own troops, leaving France isolated. The Soviet Union and China, while supporting the Viet Minh, also had their own strategic interests. Moscow sought détente with the West, while Beijing desired a stable, communist buffer state on its southern border, not necessarily a unified, powerful Vietnam that might become a regional rival. The result was the signing of the Geneva Accords on July 21, 1954. Despite the Viet Minh's overwhelming military victory, the Accords did not grant immediate, full unification and independence for all of Vietnam. Instead, a temporary compromise was reached. Vietnam was to be divided at the 17th parallel, creating a communist-controlled Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, in the north, and a non-communist state in the south. This division was explicitly stated to be temporary, with nationwide reunification elections scheduled for July 1956. Laos and Cambodia also gained their independence. French military forces were to withdraw from Vietnam, and neither North nor South Vietnam was permitted to join any military alliances or allow foreign military bases on their soil. For Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh leadership, the Geneva Accords were a bittersweet outcome. They had achieved military victory, forced the French out, and secured an independent state in the north. Yet, the temporary division was a profound disappointment. They had fought for decades for a unified, independent Vietnam, and the idea of a partitioned nation was a bitter pill. However, with their military momentum, Ho Chi Minh and Giap were confident that they would win the promised 1956 elections, believing their widespread popular support, demonstrated during the August Revolution, and Dien Bien Phu, would guarantee victory. They pragmatically accepted the compromise, viewing it as a necessary step towards eventual, peaceful reunification. In the north, Ho Chi Minh's government, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, swiftly consolidated its power. Hanoi became the capital, and the Viet Minh began the arduous task of rebuilding a nation ravaged by years of war and famine. Land reform, sometimes brutally implemented, aimed to dismantle feudal structures and redistribute land to the peasantry, solidifying communist control and popular support. Industries were nationalized, and the foundations of a socialist state began to be laid. A massive mobilization of resources and labor was directed towards recovery and development. In the south, the situation quickly diverged from the spirit of the Geneva Accords. The United States, fearing the domino effect of a communist victory in the 1956 elections, moved quickly to prevent the consolidation of a communist Vietnam. It threw its support behind Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist Catholic nationalist who had spent years in exile. Diem, with considerable American financial and political backing, swiftly moved to consolidate his power, suppress opposition, and establish the Republic of Vietnam (RVN) in October 1955. Crucially, Diem, with American encouragement, refused to hold the nationwide reunification elections mandated by the Geneva Accords, arguing that free elections were impossible under communist rule in the north. The immediate aftermath of the Geneva Accords also witnessed a massive, tragic population movement, driven by intense anti-communist propaganda from the south and genuine fears of communist rule, particularly among the Catholic minority who had often been favored by the French. Nearly 1 million Vietnamese migrated from north to south. Simultaneously, a smaller number of Viet Minh sympathizers and cadres moved from south to north. This exodus physically solidified the division, separating families and deepening ideological fault lines. The United States actively facilitated the migration south in what was termed Operation Passage to Freedom, using it as a propaganda victory against the North. The unfulfilled promise of elections and the deliberate establishment of a separate, anti-communist state in the South, backed by the growing power of the United States, laid the undeniable groundwork for the Second Indochina War. For the thousands of Viet Minh cadres who had remained in the South, instructed by Hanoi to await the elections, Diem's rejection of the Accords was a profound betrayal, forcing them back into a clandestine struggle. The initial hope of peaceful reunification shattered, replaced by an escalating tension that would soon erupt into another, even more devastating conflict. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now fraught with an agonizing irony. Vietnam was free from French colonial chains, but new ideological and political divisions, rooted in the global Cold War and the unhealed wounds of its past, now bound its people, preventing true unity. The brief period of triumphant silence after Dien Bien Phu had given way to a palpable tension, pregnant with future pain. Now that you understand the genesis of this division, what remains of your understanding of freedom? The ink on the Geneva Accords had barely dried when the two halves of Vietnam began to forge distinct and often antithetical paths. In the north, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, under the undisputed leadership of Ho Chi Minh, embarked on an ambitious program of socialist transformation and national reconstruction. Hanoi, once a colonial administrative center, now became the beating heart of an independent, communist state. The immediate priorities were to rebuild the shattered economy, recover from the ravages of the First Indochina War, and establish a new social order. Land reform was a cornerstone of this agenda, aimed at empowering the peasantry and eliminating the old feudal landlord class, while initially gaining significant popular support for its promises of land redistribution. The implementation of land reform could be brutal, leading to denunciation campaigns and purges that, in some instances, resulted in arbitrary executions and significant social upheaval. Despite these excesses, the party maintained firm control, instilling strong discipline and mobilizing the population for collective efforts in agriculture and nascent industry. Ho Chi Minh's moral authority and image as the benevolent Uncle Ho was central to maintaining national unity in the north. In the south, the newly formed state faced a far more turbulent and fragmented reality. Ngo Dinh Diem, a fervent anti-communist Catholic, rapidly consolidated his power, establishing the Republic of Vietnam in October 1955, with the crucial and unwavering support of the United States. Diem systematically dismantled rival political and religious factions that had previously challenged French authority. His security forces launched relentless denunciation campaigns against former Viet Minh cadres and suspected communists who had remained in the South, often extending to anyone deemed politically unreliable. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Diem also suppressed powerful religious sects like the Cao Dai and Ho Hao, and effectively neutralized the Bin Zion organized crime syndicate, which had previously controlled Saigon's underworld. While these actions centralized power, they alienated large segments of the population and created a deeply autocratic and repressive regime that relied heavily on American patronage. The United States, having fundamentally misread Ho Chi Minh's appeal and the depth of Vietnamese nationalism, saw Ngo Dinh Diem as the bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia, driven by the burgeoning domino theory, which posited that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. Washington committed itself fully to building a viable non-communist South Vietnam. American aid poured into Diem's government, bypassing the Geneva Accords' prohibition on foreign military alliances and bases. This aid was not merely financial. It included military advisors, training programs for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN), and significant political backing, effectively cementing the division of Vietnam and rendering the promised 1956 reunification elections null and void. For the Viet Minh cadres, who had remained in the South after 1954, instructed by Hanoi to await the promised elections and engage in political struggle, Diem's brutal repression and the cancellation of the elections presented an agonizing dilemma. They had laid down their arms, trusting in the Geneva Accords, only to face imprisonment, torture, and death. By 1957 and 1958, the Diem regime's purges had decimated their underground political networks. Faced with existential threat, these cadres, often spontaneously at first, began to resort to armed self-defense. Local units, often small and poorly equipped, resumed guerrilla actions against Diem's local officials, police, and military outposts. The armed struggle in the South had quietly, almost imperceptibly, resumed. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and the Politburo debated the course of action. The North was still recovering, and a full-scale intervention in the South carried immense risks. However, the reports of Diem's repression and the growing desperation of their comrades in the South made it clear that a purely political path was no longer viable. By 1959, after extensive deliberation, the North Vietnamese leadership made the fateful decision to fully support the armed struggle for the reunification of Vietnam. They formally recognized the necessity of armed force to overthrow the Diem regime and achieve national liberation. This decision was codified in Resolution 15 of the Central Committee of the Lao Dong Party Workers' Party of Vietnam, which officially called for the liberation of the South by military means. This strategic pivot necessitated a reliable logistical lifeline. The old trails used against the French were expanded and formalized into what would become legendary, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This vast and intricate network of paths, roads, and tunnels, stretching through Laos and Cambodia, became the artery, supplying the burgeoning insurgency in the south with men, weapons, and materiel. It was a monumental undertaking, built and maintained under constant aerial bombardment, traversing some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not just a supply route, it was a symbol of North Vietnam's unwavering commitment to the unification of their nation. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, resonated with chilling prescience. The chains of division, fueled by Cold War ideology and the failures of diplomacy, were now being forged into weapons. The pain of separation, the courage of defiance, and the enduring humanity of a people, caught between competing visions of their future, were about to be tested in a crucible of unprecedented violence. What unforeseen agonies would such a commitment to liberation demand? With Hanoi's official decision to support the armed struggle in the South, the guerrilla insurgency, which had simmered since the cancellation of the 1956 elections, began to rapidly intensify and organize. What started as desperate acts of self-defense by isolated cadres quickly evolved into a coordinated, strategic campaign. Weapons and supplies, meticulously transported down the expanding Ho Chi Minh Trail, began to reach the southern revolutionaries in greater quantities. Small, localized attacks on government officials, military outposts, and transportation lines grew in frequency and sophistication. The South Vietnamese countryside, particularly the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, became fertile ground for recruitment, as the Diem regime's repressive policies and perceived corruption alienated much of the rural population. To give political legitimacy and a broader base to the escalating armed struggle, the National Liberation Front (NLF) was formally established in December 1960. While the NLF's leadership included a significant number of communists, it presented itself as a broad coalition of various groups opposed to Diem's authoritarian rule: peasants, intellectuals, religious leaders, and disaffected, non-communist nationalists. Its program called for an end to American interference, the overthrow of the Diem government, land reform, and eventual peaceful reunification. This inclusive facade proved highly effective in mobilizing widespread popular support. The armed wing became known to the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies as the Viet Cong, a derogatory contraction of Vietnamese communist, a term that nonetheless stuck. Ngo Dinh Diem's response to the growing insurgency was to double down on repression and implement increasingly unpopular policies. His most ambitious and ultimately disastrous initiative was the Strategic Hamlet Program, launched in 1962 with heavy American backing. This program aimed to consolidate rural populations into fortified villages, ostensibly to protect them from Viet Cong infiltration and influence. However, it often involved forced relocation, the destruction of ancestral lands, and the disruption of traditional village life, generating widespread resentment. Instead of isolating the Viet Cong, the program often served to drive more peasants into their ranks, as they saw the Diem government as the oppressor. Diem's reliance on his loyalist brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and his politically ambitious sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, further alienated segments of the urban elite and the military. As their authoritarianism and corruption became increasingly blatant, the rising tide of insurgency and Diem's faltering grip on the countryside led the United States to significantly increase its involvement. Under President John F. Kennedy, the U.S. shifted from primarily financial aid to a more direct advisory role. Thousands of American military advisors were dispatched to South Vietnam to train and equip the Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN). Covert operations intensified, and American military assistance expanded to include helicopters and limited combat support. Yet, despite this increasing American commitment, the NLF continued to gain ground, exposing the inherent weaknesses of the Diem regime and the ARVN. The situation reached a critical breaking point in 1963 with the Buddhist crisis. Buddhists, who constituted the majority of South Vietnam's population, faced discrimination and repression under Diem's Catholic-dominated government. Protests escalated after government forces fired on Buddhist demonstrators in Hue. The crisis culminated in a series of shocking self-immolations by Buddhist monks, most famously Thich Quang Duc in Saigon, whose burning body captured global attention and graphically illustrated the regime's tyranny. Diem's heavy-handed response, including the brutal raids on pagodas led by NGO Dinh Nhieu Special Forces, further enraged the population and profoundly alienated the American public and the Kennedy administration. The Buddhist crisis, coupled with the NLF's military gains, convinced the United States that Diem had become an insurmountable liability, unable to unite his people or win the war against communism. Covert communications between the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and disaffected ARV generals intensified. The U.S. signaled that it would not oppose a military coup. On November 1, 1963, a group of ARVN generals, with tacit American approval, launched a coup against Diem. The coup was swift and brutal. Diem and his brother Nhieu were captured and assassinated, their bodies found the next morning. The overthrow of Diem ushered in a period of intense political instability in South Vietnam, with a succession of short-lived military juntas vying for power, none able to establish broad legitimacy or effectively prosecute the war. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership viewed Diem's overthrow not as a setback, but as a confirmation of their strategy and a new opportunity. They believed that the political chaos in the South, exacerbated by the American decision to sacrifice their ally, weakened the enemy and created more favorable conditions for the revolutionary struggle. The long war, fueled by the conviction that their nation could not be free while its people remained bound by the chains of the past, was now entering its next, terrifying phase. What further, unspeakable costs would this internal division exact upon the very soul of Vietnam? The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963, though initially welcomed by some in Washington as a necessary step, plunged South Vietnam into a period of profound political instability. A rapid succession of military juntas seized and lost power, each proving incapable of establishing broad legitimacy or effectively prosecuting the war against the increasingly potent National Liberation Front, NLF. The political vacuum at the top of the Saigon regime further emboldened the Viet Cong, who capitalized on the chaos to expand their control over the countryside. The American commitment, initially framed as advisory, was now confronted with the imminent prospect of a complete collapse of their South Vietnamese ally. The United States, under President Lyndon B. Johnson, found itself at a critical juncture. The rationale for deeper involvement was multifaceted: to prevent the fall of South Vietnam to communism, which was seen as a direct challenge to American credibility on the global stage; to uphold the domino theory, fearing that Vietnam's fall would lead to the collapse of other non-communist governments in Southeast Asia; and to demonstrate American resolve in the face of perceived communist aggression. The belief was that a strong show of force would compel North Vietnam to cease its support for the insurgency and negotiate a peaceful settlement. The pivotal moment for direct American military escalation came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer on an intelligence-gathering mission off the coast of North Vietnam, engaged 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats in what was described as a defensive action. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second torpedo attack in stormy weather. While the first incident was largely confirmed, the second alleged attack was highly contentious, with later evidence suggesting it likely never occurred or was significantly exaggerated due to confused radar readings and crew overreactions. Despite the ambiguities of the second incident, President Johnson seized upon the reports to rally congressional support for a decisive response. Within days, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted the President broad authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was, in essence, a blank check, allowing the President to commit the United States to a full-scale war in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war, effectively bypassing constitutional checks and balances. This resolution would serve as the legal foundation for the massive escalation that followed. The first major military response came in March 1965 with the initiation of Operation Rolling Thunder. A sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The objectives were clear: to interdict the flow of men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to break North Vietnam's will to fight, and to bolster the morale of the faltering South Vietnamese government and military. American aircraft relentlessly pounded targets in North Vietnam, from supply depots and bridges to military installations. However, the bombing campaign proved far less effective than anticipated. North Vietnam's largely agrarian economy was difficult to cripple, and its dispersed, resilient supply networks, relying on human labor and ingenious camouflage, adapted to the bombing, ensuring the continued flow of aid to the south. Just days after the commencement of Rolling Thunder, the United States made another monumental commitment: the deployment of its first ground combat troops. On March 8, 1965, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang, ostensibly to protect the American airbase. This was a critical turning point, shifting the American role from advisory to direct combat. What began as a few thousand Marines quickly escalated into a massive deployment. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam, and the numbers would swell to over 500,000 in subsequent years. The war was no longer just a Vietnamese struggle. It was now an American war. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership observed this immense escalation with unyielding resolve. They knew they could not defeat the United States in a conventional military confrontation. Instead, they adapted their strategy, committing to a protracted war of attrition. Their goal was not to win decisive battles against the technologically superior Americans, but to bleed them, to raise the human and financial cost of the war to an unbearable level, and to outlast their political will. They emphasized guerrilla warfare in the south, relying on tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes, while maintaining strict discipline and political indoctrination. The fight, they believed, was for the very soul of their nation, and they were prepared to endure any suffering to achieve complete independence. The philosophical question: can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past? Now reverberated with the thunder of American bombs. The chains of Cold War ideology, of a perceived communist monolithic threat, had fully enveloped Vietnam. The pain of the past, now amplified by the relentless American war machine, demanded unimaginable courage. What humanity could possibly survive such a relentless deluge of destruction? With the arrival of hundreds of thousands of American ground troops by 1965, the war in Vietnam escalated into a grinding, conventional conflict overlaid with persistent guerrilla warfare. The United States military, accustomed to decisive victories and overwhelming firepower, implemented a strategy primarily focused on search and destroy missions. Large American units, often supported by helicopters, tanks, and immense air power, would sweep through suspected Viet Cong strongholds, attempting to locate and eliminate enemy forces. Success was often measured by body counts, a grim metric that frequently included civilian casualties and encouraged a ruthless approach to the battlefield. Early major engagements, such as the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, demonstrated the ferocity of the fighting and the tenacity of the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong. Even against superior American technology, the conflict was a stark demonstration of asymmetrical warfare. The United States brought unprecedented technological might to bear. B-52 bombers rained down destruction from high altitudes. Napalm incinerated vast swathes of jungle, and artillery bombarded suspected enemy positions with relentless precision. Chemical defoliants like Agent Orange were sprayed across the landscape to deny the Viet Cong cover, inadvertently causing devastating long-term health and environmental consequences for the Vietnamese people. Yet, against this overwhelming power, the Viet Cong and NVA employed their deep understanding of the terrain, their vast network of tunnels and hidden supply routes, and their enduring support from the local population. They launched ambushes, laid booby traps, and disappeared into the jungle or underground after striking, frustrating American attempts to find and fix them in open battle. The Vietnamese civilian population bore the brunt of this escalating conflict, caught between the relentless pursuit of the Viet Cong by American and ARVN forces and the often brutal control exerted by the Viet Cong themselves. Their lives were irrevocably shattered. Villages were destroyed by aerial bombardment, artillery fire, or during ground operations. often under suspicion of harboring enemy forces. Millions were displaced, forced into refugee camps or strategic hamlets, severing their ties to ancestral lands and traditional ways of life. The constant threat of violence, the destruction of infrastructure, and the pervasive presence of war stripped away any semblance of normalcy, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and loss. The human cost, far beyond the military casualties, was staggering and largely unquantified. Despite the relentless bombing campaigns of Operation Rolling Thunder and the increasing saturation of American ground forces, the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained a vital, almost mystical, artery. Thousands of North Vietnamese laborers, engineers, and soldiers worked tirelessly to keep the complex network of paths, roads, and waterways open, often repairing bombed sections within hours. Supplies, from individual bullets to disassembled tanks, were transported by human porters, modified bicycles, and rudimentary trucks, moving primarily at night. The trail was a testament to North Vietnam's unyielding resolve, absorbing immense punishment, yet never ceasing its flow of aid to the South, demonstrating a capacity for resilience that continually defied American expectations. Back in the United States, as casualty figures mounted and media coverage brought the brutal realities of the war into American living rooms, a powerful anti-war movement began to gain momentum. Students, civil rights leaders, and growing segments of the public questioned the morality of the war, its objectives, and its increasing cost in American lives and resources. Draft resistance grew, protests swelled in size and frequency, and the political consensus that had initially supported the war began to fray. This domestic dissent became a crucial factor in Ho Chi Minh's long-term strategy, as he accurately predicted that American public opinion would ultimately tire of the conflict. Ho Chi Minh, though aging and increasingly frail, remained the unwavering symbol of Vietnamese resistance. From Hanoi, he continued to issue appeals for national unity and unwavering sacrifice, constantly reminding his people that the struggle, no matter how arduous, was for the ultimate liberation of their homeland. He steadfastly refused to negotiate under duress, insisting on the complete withdrawal of American forces and the reunification of Vietnam as preconditions for peace. His resolve, broadcast through radio and official statements, mirrored the resilience of his people enduring the relentless American bombardment and the horrors of ground combat. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now illuminated by the searing flames of napalm and the agonizing cries of the innocent. The chains of ideological conflict, of national pride, and of geopolitical power plays were binding Vietnam tighter than ever, demanding an unprecedented level of human pain and courage. What enduring testament to humanity could possibly emerge from such widespread destruction? By late 1967, the Vietnam War appeared to be mired in a bloody stalemate. Despite the overwhelming firepower and hundreds of thousands of American troops, the United States was struggling to achieve decisive military victories. General William Westmoreland, the American commander, consistently reported progress to the American public, highlighting rising enemy body counts and projecting an eventual path to victory. However, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership understood that a prolonged military deadlock, while costly, played into their strategy of attrition. They believed that the American public's will to fight would eventually erode under the weight of casualties and the perceived endlessness of the war. To accelerate this erosion and shatter the illusion of progress, they conceived a daring, audacious plan, a massive, coordinated offensive across the length and breadth of South Vietnam, designed to spark a general uprising among the southern population and force the U.S. to the negotiating table. This audacious plan materialized as the Tet Offensive, launched on the night of January 30th to 31st, 1968, coinciding with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a traditional period of ceasefire. Taking advantage of the widespread holiday celebrations, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army NVA forces simultaneously attacked over 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam, including 36 of 44 provincial capitals and the critical military installations and government centers within Saigon itself. The sheer scale and coordination of the offensive caught American and South Vietnamese forces completely by surprise. Special Viet Cong commando units even penetrated the heavily guarded U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, holding parts of it for several hours, a symbolic blow that resonated globally. The most prolonged and brutal fighting occurred in the ancient imperial capital of Hue, NVA, and Viet Cong forces rapidly seized control of most of the city, including the historic citadel. For nearly a month, American Marines and ARVN troops fought house to house, street to street, to dislodge the entrenched enemy. The battle was a horrific display of urban warfare, reducing much of the beautiful city to rubble and resulting in immense casualties on all sides. After the city was retaken, evidence emerged of a brutal massacre of thousands of civilians by Viet Cong and NVA forces in Hue, targeted for their perceived collaboration with the South Vietnamese government. This dark chapter highlighted the extreme ideological ruthlessness of the conflict. From a purely military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a devastating tactical defeat for the NVA and Viet Cong. They suffered enormous casualties, estimated at tens of thousands killed, and many of their experienced cadres and political infrastructure in the south were decimated. The hoped-for general uprising of the South Vietnamese population against the Diem regime long since defunct, and the Americans never materialized. Militarily, the offensive failed to achieve its immediate objectives of holding territory or sparking a widespread rebellion. However, the psychological and political impact of the Tet Offensive in the United States was catastrophic for the American war effort. Despite Westmoreland's previous assurances of progress and victory being in sight, the images of Viet Cong guerrillas fighting inside the U.S. Embassy, of fierce urban combat in major cities, and of the sheer scale of the coordinated attacks, shattered the narrative the Johnson administration had carefully constructed. The American public felt betrayed, realizing they had been misled about the true state of the war. A massive credibility gap opened between the government and its citizens. Iconic and unfiltered media coverage, notably the somber on-air report by revered CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who declared that the war was mired in stalemate and that victory was not achievable, profoundly shifted public opinion against the war. Support for the conflict plummeted, turning a majority of Americans against further escalation. The political fallout was immediate and dramatic. President Lyndon B. Johnson, facing a collapsing political consensus, declining approval ratings, and a formidable challenge from anti-war candidates within his own party, made a stunning announcement on March 31, 1968. He would not seek re-election. Tet had broken his presidency and irrevocably altered the course of American politics. For Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese leadership, the Tet Offensive was a strategic triumph, regardless of its tactical costs. They had proven that no part of South Vietnam was safe, including the heavily defended cities. They had fundamentally shattered American public confidence and intensified the anti-war movement, which was precisely their long-term objective. They understood that in a protracted war, the battle for hearts and minds, especially in the enemy's homeland, was as crucial as any battlefield victory. The pain of their own casualties was immense, but the courage to inflict such a psychological blow was paramount. The philosophical question: can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past? Resonated with an agonizing complexity after Tet. The past promises of American military might and easy victory had shattered, exposing the deep fissures within the American psyche. The pain of the battlefield, the courage of the combatants, and the enduring humanity of those caught in the chaos now reached a terrifying crescendo. What profound and lasting scars would this pivotal moment leave on the conscience of a superpower? The seismic political impact of the Tet Offensive in the United States forced a fundamental rethinking of American strategy in Vietnam. With President Lyndon B. Johnson stepping aside, Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 on a promise to end the war and bring peace with honor. His administration, beginning in 1969, unveiled a new policy known as Viet. The core idea was to gradually withdraw American combat troops while simultaneously training, equipping and empowering the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to assume full responsibility for the fighting. It was a strategy designed to reduce American casualties, quell domestic dissent, and achieve an honorable exit, all while maintaining a non-communist South Vietnam. Despite the rhetoric of winding down the war, the conflict expanded geographically to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and sanctuaries in neighboring countries. Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia in 1969, followed by a ground invasion in 1970. Similar operations were conducted in Laos. These incursions, intended to buy time for Vietnamization and weaken the enemy, had a profoundly destabilizing effect on Cambodia, contributing to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. When news of the secret bombing and invasions leaked, it ignited a fresh wave of outrage and intensified the anti-war movement across the United States, leading to massive protests, including the tragic Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed for unarmed student protesters. All the while, back in Paris, protracted and often acrimonious peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam dragged on, seemingly without end. Ho Chi Minh, though aging, remained the steadfast guiding light for the North Vietnamese delegation. His fundamental demand never wavered: complete and unconditional withdrawal of all American forces from Vietnam and the allowing of the Vietnamese people to determine their own future without foreign interference. He understood that time was on his side and that the rising domestic opposition in the United States would eventually force their hand. Then, on September 2, 1969, the very day Vietnam celebrated its declaration of independence from France, the nation and the global communist movement suffered a profound loss. Ho Chi Minh died at the age of 79. For decades, he had been the embodiment of the Vietnamese Revolution, its moral compass, its strategic architect, and its tireless advocate. His death was a moment of immense grief for the Vietnamese people, yet it also solidified their resolve. His will, publicly read to the nation, called for continued unity and sacrifice until complete victory was achieved. His successors, notably, Le Duan, maintained his strategic vision, ensuring that the struggle would continue along the path he had forged. The loss was immeasurable, but the movement he had built was designed to endure beyond any single individual. Even with Vietnamization underway, the war remained brutally intense. US and ARVN forces continued to engage NVA and Viet Cong units in fierce combat across South Vietnam. Casualties remained high on all sides, contributing to the growing disillusionment within the American military. Morale among U.S. troops declined sharply, exacerbated by drug use, racial tensions, and the perception of a pointless war. The complexities of fighting an elusive enemy in a hostile civilian population continued to plague American efforts, making every search and destroy mission a costly and often futile endeavor. In the United States, the anti-war movement escalated to unprecedented levels. Revelations of atrocities, such as the My Lai massacre, where unarmed Vietnamese civilians were systematically murdered by American soldiers, further fueled public outrage and moral questioning. Massive demonstrations, teach-ins, and acts of civil disobedience became commonplace, ripping apart the fabric of American society and creating deep divisions between those who supported the OFD war and those who vehemently opposed it. This profound social unrest, coupled with the immense financial cost of the war, placed immense pressure on the Nixon administration to find a way out. North Vietnam, despite the loss of Ho Chi Minh and the continued American bombing and ground operations, held firm to its strategy of protracted war. They continued to leverage the growing anti-war sentiment in the U.S., understanding that the political battleground was as crucial as the military one. They rebuilt their forces, deepened their tunnel networks, and continued to pour men and materiel down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, preparing for the decisive moments that they believed would inevitably come. When America's will would finally break, the philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now agonizingly answered in the prolonged agony of Vietnam. The chains of Cold War ideology, of national pride, and of the failures of past policies now shackled both the colonizer and the colonized in a vortex of pain, courage, and desperate humanity. What unspoken truths were revealed in the brutal, unrelenting resistance that endured even after the loss of its most revered leader. Act for conclusion. We have concluded Act 4, charting the agonizing period of direct American military involvement, the psychological turning point of Tet, the strategic shift to Vietnamization, and the profound personal loss for North Vietnam. With the death of Ho Chi Minh, the stage is now set for Act V, which will cover the American withdrawal and the final years of the war, leading to the ultimate reunification of Vietnam. Despite the ongoing policy of Vietnamization and the gradual reduction of American ground troops, the early 1970s saw no diminution in the intensity of the war in Vietnam. President Richard Nixon, committed to achieving peace with honor, sought to bolster the South Vietnamese government while simultaneously negotiating an American withdrawal. The strategy relied heavily on U.S. air power and the increasing capabilities of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, now equipped with vast quantities of American weaponry and receiving extensive training. ARVN forces, with American air and logistical support, undertook major operations, such as Lam Son 719 in 1971, an ill-fated incursion into Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Though a tactical failure for ARVN, it demonstrated the continued reliance on U.S. air support, which remained decisive. In early 1972, North Vietnam launched its largest conventional offensive since the Tet Offensive, the Easter Offensive, designed to achieve a decisive victory before the U.S. fully withdrew and to gain leverage at the peace talks. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, attacked on 3 fronts simultaneously across South Vietnam, employing tanks, heavy artillery, and large infantry formations. The scale and conventional nature of the assault initially overwhelmed ARVN defenses, pushing deep into South Vietnamese territory and threatening key cities like Quang Tri, Hue, and An Loc. The offensive demonstrated the NVA's growing conventional capabilities and their willingness to accept heavy casualties for strategic gains. The United States responded with overwhelming air power. President Nixon unleashed Operation Linebacker, i.e., a massive aerial bombardment campaign against NVA forces in South Vietnam and, crucially, against strategic targets in North Vietnam itself. Thousands of sorties were flown, raining bombs and cluster munitions on NVA troop concentrations, supply depots, and transportation networks. This unprecedented use of air power, including the first widespread deployment of smart bombs, inflicted severe damage on NVA forces and logistical lines, ultimately blunting the Easter Offensive and preventing a complete ARVN collapse. While the offensive did not achieve its military objectives of sparking a general uprising or securing a decisive victory, it underscored the fragility of the South Vietnamese government without direct U.S. combat support and intensified diplomatic efforts. The ferocity of the Easter Offensive and the heavy cost of the American air response created an urgent new dynamic at the Paris peace talks. After years of stalemate, secret negotiations between U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc, though, gained new momentum. Both sides, exhausted by the war and facing immense domestic pressure, were more willing to make concessions. Breakthroughs were achieved on key issues, including the crucial agreement that the U.S. would withdraw all its troops and that the political future of South Vietnam would be left to direct negotiations between the Vietnamese parties, without preconditions. However, just as a peace agreement seemed imminent, negotiations again faltered in December 1972. Largely due to South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thor's objections to the proposed terms and North Vietnam's last-minute demands. In response, President Nixon launched Operation Linebacker 2, famously known as the Christmas bombing. For 11 days, from December 18th to 29th, American B-52 bombers carried out the most intense bombing campaign of the war against Hanoi and Haiphong, targeting military installations, airfields, and railway yards. The bombing was highly controversial, drawing international condemnation and fierce protests within the U.S. Its exact impact on the peace talks remains debated. Some argue it forced North Vietnam back to the table, while others contend they were already prepared to sign and the bombing was a show of force for Saigon and domestic audiences. Regardless, negotiations resumed swiftly. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were formally signed by representatives of the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the NLF's political arm. The agreement stipulated a ceasefire throughout Vietnam, the withdrawal of all remaining U.S. military personnel within 60 days, the release of all prisoners of war, and an agreement on the future political process for South Vietnam, which included a commitment to reunification through peaceful means and the establishment of a National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord to organize elections. Crucially, North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain in the south. Following the signing of the accords, the United States rapidly completed its troop withdrawal. By March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops had left Vietnam, marking the end of direct U.S. military involvement in a conflict that had spanned nearly a decade for America and decades for Vietnam. For Ho Chi Minh, though he had passed away 4 years earlier, this moment was the culmination of his life's singular pursuit. His vision, his strategic genius, and his unwavering determination had ultimately forced the most powerful nation on earth to withdraw. Yet, the peace was a fragile one. A compromise that left Vietnam still divided and promised a political future that both sides knew would be decided not by ballots, but by bullets. The bitterness of this incomplete peace and the immense human cost weighed heavily. The philosophical question: can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past? Remained tragically unanswered. The chains of foreign intervention were broken, but the deeper chains of political division, ideological animosity, and unhealed wounds meant that true unification and true peace remained elusive. The reflection on past sacrifices, now tinged with the bitterness of an incomplete victory, cast a long shadow. What enduring legacy of pain, courage, and humanity would now be etched into the very soul of this land? The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 brought a fragile, fleeting illusion of peace. For Vietnam, however, it quickly became a period of peace without peace. The ink had barely dried before both sides violated the ceasefire. North Vietnam, believing that the withdrawal of American combat troops had fundamentally shifted the balance of power, swiftly moved to consolidate and expand its control in the south. They systematically improved and extended the Ho Chi Minh Trail, transforming it from a mere infiltration route into a modern logistical highway, capable of moving tanks, heavy artillery, and entire divisions into striking distance of South Vietnamese positions. Existing supply depots and staging areas in the south were expanded, and political infrastructure was rebuilt in areas the Viet Cong had previously controlled. Meanwhile, the Republic of Vietnam in the south found itself isolated and increasingly vulnerable. Crucially, the substantial U.S. aid to South Vietnam began to diminish sharply after 1973. A war-weary American public, disillusioned by years of conflict and reeling from the Watergate scandal, exerted immense pressure on Congress to reduce military spending abroad. Congressional restrictions limited financial and military assistance to Saigon, preventing the replacement of lost equipment and severely impacting ARVN's operational capabilities, morale, and ability to sustain prolonged combat. Fuel, spare parts, and ammunition became critically scarce, crippling the ARVN's Air Force and armored units, which had been designed to fight a U.S.-style mechanized war. Observing this rapid deterioration of the South Vietnamese military and the clear lack of political will for re-intervention in Washington, the North Vietnamese Politburo made its fateful decision. After months of careful assessment, they concluded that the conditions were ripe for a final, decisive offensive to achieve the long-sought reunification of Vietnam by force. They believed that the ARVN was a hollow force and that the United States would not return to save it. General Van Tien Dung was put in command of the final campaign. The final offensive began in March 1975. With stunning speed and overwhelming force, the initial target was Ban My Thuot, a strategically vital city in the Central Highlands. The NVA launched a swift, crushing attack, overrunning the city within days. The fall of Ban My Thuot sent shockwaves through the ARVN command and plunged the South Vietnamese government into a panic. In a disastrous miscalculation, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu, fearing his forces would be encircled in the Central Highlands, ordered a strategic withdrawal from the entire region. This order, intended to consolidate forces for a defensive line further south, quickly devolved into an unmitigated rout. ARVN units, lacking coherent leadership, logistical support, and proper planning, abandoned their positions in disarray. Soldiers, often accompanied by their families, streamed down Route 7 and Route 14 in a chaotic, desperate flight, harassed by NVA artillery and small unit attacks. This precipitous and uncoordinated retreat became known as the Convoy of Tears, as tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished from NVA fire, starvation, or disease along the escape routes. The collapse in the Central Highlands was swift and catastrophic, opening up the entire northern half of South Vietnam to the advancing NVA. The speed of the North Vietnamese advance was astonishing. Capitalizing on the ARVN's collapse, NVA columns swept down the coast, taking provincial capitals with minimal resistance. Hue and Da Nang, once symbols of the bitter fighting, fell with shocking rapidity. Overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of the North Vietnamese offensive and the desertion of ARVN units, the entire South Vietnamese northern military region evaporated. Within weeks, the NVA's logistical network, painstakingly built over years, now supported a conventional army advancing at a pace previously thought impossible for them. As the NVA forces closed in on Saigon, a palpable sense of growing chaos and despair gripped South Vietnam. The scale of the military collapse triggered a massive refugee crisis. Millions of civilians, terrified of the advancing communist forces and seeking escape, crammed onto boats, planes, and roads, desperately trying to reach Saigon or flee the country altogether. Law and order broke down in many areas, and the internal collapse of the South Vietnamese government accelerated. The bitterness of a lost cause, the reflection on years of struggle, and the dawning realization of their inevitable fate settled over the remaining population. Saigon, once a vibrant, hopeful city, became a vortex of fear and desperation, awaiting the final decisive blow. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was now being answered in the most brutal way possible. The chains of a divided nation, of an imposed foreign will, and of a corrupted local leadership were shattering under the weight of an implacable, unified force. The pain of this final collapse, the courage of those still fighting or desperately fleeing, and the raw humanity laid bare in the face of annihilation, became the defining moments of a nation's fate. What profound, enduring silence would finally descend when all resistance ceased? As April 1975 drew to a close, the fate of South Vietnam was sealed. The lightning-fast collapse of ARVN defenses in the Central Highlands and along the coast had cleared the path for the North Vietnamese Army's relentless march south. Saigon, the glittering capital of the Republic of Vietnam, was now encircled. NVA divisions, bolstered by tanks and heavy artillery, tightened their noose around the city. The remaining ARVN forces, demoralized and outmaneuvered, offered sporadic and disorganized resistance. The hope of a last stand, once whispered in the streets, evaporated in the face of the overwhelming communist advance. Within Saigon, the atmosphere was one of growing panic and chaos. Thousands of South Vietnamese, particularly those associated with the government, military, or American presence, desperately sought to escape. The U.S. Embassy, once a symbol of American power and commitment, became the focal point of a frantic and desperate evacuation. Operation Frequent Wind, the final phase of the American withdrawal, commenced on April 29, 1975. Marine helicopters, operating from rooftops, airlifted American personnel and thousands of at-risk South Vietnamese allies to waiting ships in the South China Sea. The iconic images of desperate Vietnamese scrambling up ladders to the embassy roof, vying for a place on the last helicopters, became a poignant and enduring symbol of the war's end and the human cost of a lost cause. The evacuation was a chaotic, heartbreaking scramble for survival, as the last vestiges of American presence vanished under the shadow of an impending communist victory. On the morning of April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks, including a T-54 tank famously crashing through the gates, rolled into the presidential palace in Saigon. General Duong Ban Minh, who had only been president for 2 days and was the last leader of South Vietnam, formally surrendered unconditionally to the NVA, declaring an end to all resistance. The sound of the victorious NVA soldiers entering the city was met with a mixture of relief from some, fear from others, and a profound, exhausted silence from a population that had endured decades of ceaseless conflict. The war, for the entire nation, was finally over. Saigon, the jewel of the South, was swiftly renamed Ho Chi Minh City, a powerful symbolic act marking the ultimate triumph of the Communist Revolution and the unification of Vietnam under a single, socialist government. For the North, the fall of Saigon was the culmination of a century-long struggle against foreign domination, a moment of profound triumph and national pride. Their unwavering determination, immense sacrifice, and strategic brilliance had finally brought about the reunification of their homeland. However, the immediate aftermath of reunification for the South was fraught with immense challenges and often harsh realities. The new government swiftly implemented policies aimed at integrating the South into the socialist system of the North. For those associated with the former Saigon regime, this meant re-education camps, where hundreds of thousands of former military officers, civil servants, and intellectuals were subjected to political indoctrination and forced labor. Often, for years, private enterprises were nationalized, and agriculture underwent a period of forced collectivization, leading to significant economic hardship and resentment. Dissidents were suppressed, and political freedoms were severely curtailed. These harsh policies, coupled with economic stagnation and fear of retribution, led to a massive humanitarian crisis. The exodus of hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions, of South Vietnamese refugees, known globally as the Boat People. They braved perilous journeys across the South China Sea in overcrowded, unseaworthy vessels, facing piracy, starvation, and drowning, all in a desperate quest for freedom and safety in other countries. This mass migration underscored the deep scars left by the war and the profound ideological divide that continued to separate many Vietnamese, even after ostensible reunification. For Ho Chi Minh, though he did not live to see this day, his vision of a unified, independent Vietnam was undeniably fulfilled. The foreign powers had been expelled, and the nation was, at least in name, one. Yet the nature of this reunification, achieved through devastating war and followed by a period of ideological restructuring and hardship, certainly carried a profound bitterness. The freedom attained came at an unimaginable cost, and the specific form of the unified state might not have fully aligned with the broader, more inclusive vision he sometimes articulated in earlier, more idealistic moments. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, found its starkest answer in the fall of Saigon. The chains of division were broken, replaced by the chains of a single, dominant ideology. The bitterness of a long-fought victory, the haunting reflection on countless lives lost, and the enduring legacy of courage and profound humanity were now etched into the very identity of Vietnam. What kind of peace, then, could truly emerge from such a long, bitter struggle? The triumphant entry of North Vietnamese tanks into Saigon on April 30, 1975, brought an end to decades of warfare, but it ushered in a new era of immense and complex challenges for the newly unified nation. The scale of the destruction was staggering, a landscape scarred by bombs, defoliants, and unexploded ordnance, infrastructure severely damaged or destroyed, and millions of people displaced, orphaned, or left with permanent physical and psychological wounds. Widespread poverty gripped both North and South. The legacy of continuous conflict and the disruption of traditional economic life. The new government inherited a devastated land and a populace deeply divided by experience and ideology. In the South, the immediate priority for the communist government was to consolidate political control and integrate the former Republic of Vietnam into the socialist system. This often involved harsh measures. The notorious re-education camps became a stark reality for hundreds of thousands of former ARVN officers, civil servants, intellectuals, and religious leaders, designed to purify those tainted by the old regime and Western influence. These camps often involved grueling forced labor, political indoctrination, and severe deprivation, sometimes lasting for years or even over a decade. Beyond the camps, the new government sought to suppress all forms of dissent, dismantle former institutions, and impose a centrally controlled political and social order across the entire country. Freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, as understood in the West, was severely curtailed. Economically, the unified Vietnam attempted to implement a centrally planned, socialist model across the entire nation. This involved the nationalization of industries and the collectivization of agriculture, particularly in the more capitalist-oriented South. However, these policies faced significant resistance and proved largely ineffective. Farmers in the South, accustomed to private land ownership and market incentives, resented collectivization, leading to declining agricultural output. The disruption of established trade networks, the lack of management expertise, and the inherent inefficiencies of central planning resulted in widespread economic stagnation and severe food shortages. The government's ambitious plans for rapid industrialization often faltered due to a lack of resources and technical know-how. Compounding these internal struggles was Vietnam's profound international isolation. The United States, bitter over its defeat and wary of a unified communist Vietnam, imposed a comprehensive economic embargo that prevented trade, investment, and humanitarian aid. Western nations largely followed suit, leaving Vietnam heavily reliant on aid and trade from the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies. This isolation severely hampered Vietnam's ability to rebuild its economy, access crucial technology, or attract foreign investment, prolonging the period of hardship. Moreover, the promise of peace after decades of war proved fleeting as Vietnam quickly found itself embroiled in new regional conflicts. Border clashes with the brutal Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, led by Pol Pot, escalated throughout the mid-1970s. The Khmer Rouge, ideologically extreme and pursuing a genocidal agenda, launched cross-border raids that targeted Vietnamese civilians. This culminated in Vietnam's full-scale invasion of Cambodia in December 1978, which swiftly overthrew the Khmer Rouge, installing a pro-Vietnamese government. This act, while ending the Cambodian genocide, drew the ire of China, which viewed Vietnam's growing influence in Indochina with alarm. China, a former ally of North Vietnam, launched a punitive invasion of Vietnam's northern border in February 1979. Initiating the brief but brutal Sino-Vietnamese War. These conflicts, though short-lived, further drained Vietnam's already scarce resources and postponed any real peace dividend. Despite the severe economic hardships and ongoing conflicts, signs of pragmatic adaptation began to emerge at the grassroots level in the early 1980s. Farmers, desperate to feed their families, engaged in informal market activities. Local officials often turned a blind eye to these nascent private ventures, recognizing their necessity for survival. These were the very early tentative steps towards what would eventually become the comprehensive Doi Moi renovation. Economic reforms, born not of ideological shift, but of sheer necessity and the failure of strict central planning. The unified Vietnam, now reflecting on its bitter victory, faced the monumental task of addressing the immense human costs of the war, while simultaneously constructing a new national identity. The legacy of pain, courage, and humanity, forged in decades of struggle, was now being weighed against the realities of peace under a new, powerful, and often unforgiving government. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free, while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, was asked anew as Vietnam, nominally unified, grappled with the deep ideological wounds and the immense physical and psychological scars of its recent history. The past of division, trauma, and conflict lingered, shaping every aspect of the present. What enduring peace could possibly be found amidst such a complex inheritance of bitterness and triumph? By the mid-1980s, Vietnam's centrally planned economy was in crisis. Years of war, international isolation, and the inherent inefficiencies of strict state control had led to widespread poverty, food shortages, and technological backwardness. Recognizing the urgent need for change, the Communist Party of Vietnam, at its 6th National Congress in 1986, officially launched the Doi Moi renovation reforms. This marked a profound ideological shift, moving away from rigid central planning towards a socialist-oriented market economy. The reforms aimed to unleash economic potential by allowing private enterprise, encouraging foreign investment, decentralizing economic decision-making, and integrating Vietnam into the global economy. It was a pragmatic and necessary step for national survival and prosperity. The impact of Doi Moi was transformative. In the decades that followed, Vietnam experienced rapid and sustained economic growth, becoming one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia. Poverty rates plummeted dramatically, millions were lifted out of destitution, and a burgeoning middle class began to emerge. The landscape of Vietnamese cities and towns was revolutionized, with new businesses, shops, and infrastructure rapidly appearing. Consumer goods, once scarce, became widely available, leading to a visible improvement in living standards for a vast segment of the population. The country, once ravaged by war and struggling to feed itself, now exported rice and became a significant player in regional and global trade. Parallel to the economic reforms, a complex and often unspoken process of internal healing and reconciliation began to unfold. While the political system remained firmly under the control of the Communist Party, the harsh repression of the immediate post-war period gradually eased. The remaining re-education camps were closed, and restrictions on movement and economic activity loosened. A crucial part of this healing involved the cautious return of the Viet Kieu, overseas Vietnamese, millions who had fled the country after 1975, who began to visit, invest, and reconnect with their families. Though profound scars remained, and full reconciliation was a multi-generational process, there was a palpable desire among many Vietnamese to look forward, to rebuild, and to move beyond the bitter divisions of the past. Vietnam's economic opening facilitated its gradual re-engagement with the international community. A major diplomatic breakthrough came in 1994 with the lifting of the crippling U.S. economic embargo, followed by the normalization of diplomatic relations with the United States in 1995. This pivotal step paved the way for increased trade, tourism, and investment from Western nations. Vietnam joined the Association of Southeast Asian Nations (ASEAN), entered into various free trade agreements, and became a member of the World Trade Organization, firmly integrating itself into the global economic and political landscape. The former adversaries began to forge a new relationship based on mutual economic interest and a cautious, evolving understanding. Amidst this rapid transformation, Vietnam also began to more systematically address the immense legacies of the war. The devastating effects of Agent Orange, which had contaminated vast tracts of land and caused severe health problems, including birth defects and cancers, for generations of Vietnamese, became a pressing concern. International efforts, often with former adversaries, commenced to clean up dioxin hotspots and provide support to victims. The massive problem of unexploded ordnance, UXO remnants of decades of bombing and shelling, continued to claim lives and hinder development. Clearance efforts, often involving international NGOs, became a continuous necessity. Efforts to identify the remains of missing soldiers, both Vietnamese and American, continued quietly, reflecting a shared, painful commitment to closure. However, rapid economic growth brought its own set of new challenges. Environmental degradation, particularly pollution from industrial expansion, became a growing concern. Corruption, fueled by the rapid influx of capital and the transition from a command economy, emerged as a significant societal issue. The widening gap between rich and poor and the growing social inequality presented new tensions. The Communist Party also faced the delicate balancing act of maintaining political control and its one-party rule in an increasingly open and connected society, navigating the pressures of globalization while upholding its socialist orientation. This era of renewal, Vietnam grappled with its complex and often contradictory past. Official narratives continued to celebrate the military victory and the unwavering spirit of resistance, honoring the immense sacrifices made for independence and reunification. Yet there was also a growing, albeit cautious, space for acknowledging the immense human cost, the diverse experiences of those who fought on different sides, and the enduring pain of a fractured nation. The bitterness of the war slowly began to yield to a more nuanced reflection, a testament to the resilience and profound humanity of a people who had endured so much. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, found a new layer of meaning in modern Vietnam. The economic chains of poverty had been broken, and the geopolitical chains of isolation loosened. Yet, the invisible chains of historical memory, ideological difference, and unhealed trauma continued to bind. The path to a complete, harmonious freedom remained long, but the enduring spirit of courage and humanity, tempered by bitterness and reflection, offered a powerful legacy. Can you now perceive how a nation, even after unspeakable suffering, finds a way to forge its future from the ashes of its past? From the vantage point of mid-2025, Vietnam stands as a testament to profound resilience and dynamic transformation. No longer defined solely by its wars, it has emerged as a vibrant, rapidly developing economy, a manufacturing hub attracting significant foreign investment from around the globe, and a popular tourist destination celebrated for its rich culture, stunning landscapes, and warm hospitality. Its cities, like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, pulse with youthful energy, bustling markets, and innovative startups, while its rural areas, though still undergoing modernization, increasingly connect to global markets. Vietnam's voice carries growing weight in regional forums like ASEAN, and on the international stage, Vietnam's foreign policy reflects a pragmatic, multidirectional approach born from centuries of navigating powerful neighbors and external interventions. It masterfully balances complex relations with its giant northern neighbor, China, with whom it shares a long history of both conflict and cooperation, often punctuated by ongoing territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Simultaneously, Vietnam has forged an increasingly strong and strategic partnership with its former adversary, the United States, driven by shared economic interests and converging geopolitical concerns. Hanoi actively diversifies its alliances, engaging with Japan, South Korea, Europe, and India, ensuring no single power dominates its strategic landscape. This nuanced diplomacy, forged through decades of hard-won independence, prioritizes national interest and sovereignty above rigid ideological alignment. Domestically, despite the sweeping economic liberalization of Doi Mua, the Communist Party of Vietnam retains firm political control. It has skillfully navigated the complexities of opening the economy while maintaining a one-party system. While there has been a significant expansion of personal economic freedom and a burgeoning consumer society, political dissent remains tightly managed, and fundamental political reforms have been limited. The party's legitimacy rests on its historical role in achieving independence and unification, and its continued delivery of economic prosperity, balancing the demands of a modernizing society with its commitment to a socialist-oriented path. Vietnamese culture and society are in a constant state of evolution. A burgeoning urbanism shapes new lifestyles, while a vibrant youth culture, deeply connected to global trends through the internet and social media, embraces modern fashion, music, and technology. Yet, beneath this dynamism, traditional family values, respect for elders, and community ties remain deeply ingrained. The vast Vietnamese diaspora, the Viet Kieu, who once fled the country, now play an increasingly important role, contributing to the economy through remittances and investments, and fostering cultural exchange, bridging the divides of the past through shared heritage. However, the war's enduring legacy remains woven into the very fabric of Vietnam. Memorials, museums, and educational curricula constantly remind the nation of the immense sacrifices made for independence. But the war's impact is also deeply personal. Millions of veterans, on both sides of the former divide, carry physical and psychological scars. The devastating effects of Agent Orange continue to manifest in new generations, demanding ongoing care and international cooperation for remediation. The quiet, persistent search for the remains of missing soldiers, known in Vietnam as martyrs, continues across the landscape. This collective memory, often tinged with bitterness for what was lost and quiet reflection on what was gained, is a powerful force shaping national identity, demonstrating the profound courage and resilience of a people who persevered through unimaginable suffering. As Vietnam strides into its future, it carries the weight and wisdom of its tumultuous past. The philosophical question, can a nation ever truly be free while its people remain bound by the chains of the past, finds a nuanced answer in contemporary Vietnam. The overt chains of foreign domination and physical division have been broken. The economic chains of poverty are being cast off, but the invisible chains of memory, trauma, ideological difference, and the sheer cost of freedom continue to bind, shaping choices, informing policies, and residing in the hearts of its people. True freedom, perhaps, is not merely the absence of external chains, but the continuous, courageous process of confronting, understanding, and reconciling with one's own complex history, allowing the bitterness to subside into reflection, and letting humanity guide the ongoing journey. Can you now truly grasp the profound legacy of Vietnam, a nation that found its unity through fire, and whose enduring spirit continues to redefine what it means to be free?